Before dawn on Friday the 13th of October, in the year 1307, royal officials across the Kingdom of France broke the seals on letters they had been holding for weeks and were forbidden to open early. The instructions inside were identical everywhere, and they were extraordinary. Every member of the Order of the Temple in France was to be arrested that morning, all of them, simultaneously. Their houses were to be seized, their property inventoried, their persons taken into custody in the name of the king. By the time the sun came up, it was done. In Paris, in Normandy, in Champagne, in Languedoc, in every preceptory and farm and chapel the order held in France, men who had gone to bed as members of the most respected military brotherhood in Christendom woke up as prisoners. The Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, who the previous day had been a pallbearer at a royal funeral, walking beside the king, was taken in Paris. Something in the region of 600 to 1,000 men were seized in a single coordinated morning, which, in an age with no telegraph, no railways, and no police force, was an act of administrative precision that had almost no precedent in medieval Europe. Hello, traveller. Tonight, we set out on the entire story of the Knights Templar. How 9 impoverished knights became the wealthiest and most feared organisation in the Western world, what they were actually accused of, and how the whole thing was destroyed in a single morning. Before we begin, take a moment, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel, but only if these journeys are truly yours. And leave a word below to say where you're listening from tonight, and the hour it is where you are. There's a quiet pleasure in seeing who else has gathered here tonight, in how many countries, under how many skies. Now, let the lights go low, let the world go quiet, and let's step into the story together. The charges, when they were read out, were almost beyond belief. The Templars were accused of denying Christ during their secret initiation ceremonies, of spitting on the cross or trampling it, of exchanging obscene kisses at admission, of worshipping an idol, a bearded head that the interrogators would eventually give a name that has echoed through 7 centuries of occult literature, of systematic sodomy, of encouraging one another in these practices as a matter of rule rather than as individual sin. Within weeks, a great many of them confessed. The Grand Master confessed. Under interrogation of a kind we will look at honestly later, men who had spent 30 and 40 years in the order admitted to denying their Saviour and spitting on the cross. And then, when the immediate pressure was removed, most of them took it back. That is where this story becomes something more interesting than a scandal. What happened between 1307 and 1314 is one of the most thoroughly documented legal proceedings of the Middle Ages. Thousands of pages of testimony survive, from hundreds of individual men in multiple countries, and historians have been working through them for 2 centuries. And the picture that emerges is not the one that either side wanted. The Templars were not the satanic conspiracy of the indictment. They were also not the flawless martyrs of the Romantic tradition. They were something considerably more human, and their destruction had far more to do with money and political power than with anything anyone believed about their souls. Tonight we are going to follow the whole arc. We will begin 200 years earlier, on the roads outside Jerusalem, where a small group of knights took vows of poverty and chastity and undertook to protect pilgrims. An idea so strange to its own century that a great abbot had to write a book explaining why it was not a sin. We will watch that idea become an institution, a papal charter that placed them beyond the reach of kings. Donations pouring in from every corner of Europe, a network of houses stretching from Ireland to Armenia, castles across the Holy Land, and a financial system so sophisticated that a pilgrim could deposit money in London and withdraw it in Jerusalem, which is, in essence, the invention of the traveller's checkway 600 years early. We will follow them into the wars, the victories that made their reputation and the catastrophes that broke it, the loss of Jerusalem, the long, slow contraction of the Crusader states, and the fall of Acre in 1291, which left a military order with no war to fight and no home to defend. And then we will follow the destruction in detail. The king who owed them a great deal of money, the pope who could not protect them, the confessions and the retractions, the fires outside Paris, and the old man burned on an island in the Seine in 1314, who is said to have called both king and pope to judgment before the year was out. Both of them died within the year, which is the sort of coincidence that makes legends. Finally, we will deal with the myths, because the Templars have generated more of them than almost any organisation in history. The lost treasure, the fleet that sailed from La Rochelle and vanished, the Holy Grail, the Freemasons, Friday the 13th. Every one of these has an origin, and almost none of the origins are medieval. We will trace where each of them actually came from, which is a more interesting story than the myths themselves. And we will look at a document rediscovered in the Vatican archives in 2001 that changes how the whole affair should be understood. To understand why the Templars existed, you have to understand what had just happened in the Eastern Mediterranean and what it did to the roads. In the year 1095, at a church council in central France, Pope Urban II made a speech. The details of what he actually said are uncertain. The surviving accounts were written afterward by people with reasons to shape the memory. But the effect is not in doubt. He called on the fighting men of Western Europe to go east, to aid the Christians of the Byzantine Empire, who had suffered a catastrophic defeat by the Seljuk Turks a generation earlier, and to recover Jerusalem, which had been under Muslim rule for more than 4 centuries. The response was far larger than anyone anticipated. What set out was not a disciplined army, but a series of overlapping expeditions, tens of thousands of people including knights, foot soldiers, servants, clergy, and a great many ordinary civilians with no military function at all, travelling overland across Europe and Anatolia in conditions that killed a substantial proportion of them before they ever saw a battle. The journey took 3 years. It included a siege at Antioch so grim that the besiegers ran out of food, and then found themselves besieged in turn. And then, against every reasonable expectation, they took Jerusalem. In July 1099, after a siege of about a month, the Crusader army broke into the city. What followed has to be stated plainly, because it matters for everything that comes after, and because sanitizing it would be dishonest. The capture of Jerusalem was accompanied by a massacre. The city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were killed in large numbers over a period of days. The sources on both sides agree on this, though the figures they give vary enormously, and modern historians treat the highest medieval numbers as rhetorical rather than statistical. Contemporary Christian chroniclers described the scene in terms of blood in the streets and did not present it as shameful. They presented it as the fulfillment of prophecy. That was the moral universe the crusade operated in. The result was a string of small Christian states along the eastern Mediterranean coast, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa. Collectively, they became known as Outremer, from the French for overseas. They were narrow, long, militarily precarious, and permanently short of manpower, because the great majority of the Crusaders went home once their vow was fulfilled. The states that remained were held by a small aristocracy of Western origin ruling over a mixed population, surrounded by Muslim polities that were, at that particular moment, divided among themselves. Which is very largely why the Crusader state survived at all. That division is worth understanding because the whole Crusader enterprise depended on it. The Islamic world of 1099 was fractured. The Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad had long since lost real power to Seljuk Turkish warlords who fought one another continuously. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt was a rival Shia power hostile to the Sunni Seljuks, and the local emirs of Syria pursued their own interests, sometimes allying with the Franks against their coreligionists. A united response would have ended the Crusader states within a decade. It did not come for 2 generations, and when it finally did come, under Zengi, then Nur ad-Din, then Saladin, each consolidating more than the last, the Crusader position became untenable with a speed that shocked Europe. The Latin East existed in a window of Muslim disunity and closed when the window closed. And now, at last, the pilgrims came. That was the whole point, from the perspective of ordinary Western Christians. Jerusalem was open. The holy places were accessible. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem had been a feature of Christian devotion for centuries, but it had always been difficult and often impossible. And now it was possible, and it was the greatest spiritual undertaking a person could attempt. Thousands set out. The roads were murder. Not metaphorically, literally. Once a pilgrim landed at the port of Jaffa, they faced a journey inland to Jerusalem of about 60 kilometers through hill country that was outside effective control, bandit-infested, and dangerous in every season. Contemporary accounts describe pilgrims robbed, killed, and left on the road in significant numbers, sometimes hundreds in a single incident. The Crusader kingdom did not have the manpower to police its own countryside. It barely had the manpower to hold its castles, which is the problem that produced the Knights Templar. Not a conspiracy, not a treasure hunt, not a secret mission to excavate under the Temple Mount. A road with bodies on it, and a kingdom too thinly held to do anything about it. That last claim, that the founding Templars were really an excavation team sent to dig under the Temple Mount for the Ark, or for hidden documents, is worth naming here because it recurs constantly in popular writing. It has no medieval basis. It was constructed in the 20th century from the fact that the Order's first headquarters happened to sit on the temple platform, which is a coincidence of royal accommodation rather than a clue. There is no contemporary source suggesting the founders dug for anything, and the practical objection is decisive. 9 impoverished knights with no funds and no equipment, living on the king's charity, are not in a position to conduct a covert excavation beneath one of the most heavily observed religious sites on earth. Around the year 1119, the precise date is uncertain, and the sources are later than the events. A French knight named Hugues de Payens from Champagne approached Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem, with a proposal. He and a small group of companions, most of them likewise from northern France, wished to take religious vows and dedicate themselves permanently to the protection of pilgrims on the roads of the Holy Land. The number usually given is 9. That figure comes from the chronicler William of Tyre, writing some 60 years later, and it may be schematic rather than exact. 9 is a resonant number, and William was writing history with a moral shape. But a small founding group is entirely plausible, and it is what the earliest surviving evidence suggests. The king gave them a place to live, quarters in the royal palace on the Temple Mount, in the structure that the Crusaders had identified as the Temple of Solomon, which was in fact the Al-Aqsa Mosque, converted after the conquest. That location gave the new brotherhood its name. They were the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. a mouthful that was quickly shortened in practice to the Templars. For their first years, they were genuinely poor and genuinely obscure. They had no papal recognition, no independent revenue, and no institutional standing beyond the king's patronage. They were a handful of men with horses and swords who had taken monastic vows, doing escort duty on a dangerous road. The famous early seal of the order, 2 knights sharing a single horse, is usually explained as a reference to that poverty. And though the interpretation has been debated, the poverty itself was real. Other readings have been offered, that it represents the brotherhood of the order, or the double nature of the Templar as monk and soldier. The seal is genuine and the image is striking either way, and it became one of the most reproduced pieces of medieval iconography, which is itself a small irony, since the order that adopted it as a symbol of poverty went on to become a byword for wealth within 50 years. What they were doing, however, was conceptually explosive, and it took a while for anyone to notice how strange it was. A monk, in the Christian tradition of that period, took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, withdrew from the world, and devoted his life to prayer. Central to the monastic life was the renunciation of violence. Killing was a sin. Even soldiers fighting in a just cause were routinely assigned penance for the deaths they caused, and clerics were forbidden to shed blood at all. A monk who killed a man would face grave consequences for his soul. These men proposed to be monks who killed people as their vocation, not soldiers who prayed, and not monks who occasionally defended themselves. A religious order whose entire purpose was armed violence, performed as an act of devotion. There was no precedent for it in Christianity, and there was a real risk that the Church would reject the whole idea as a contradiction in terms. The objections were made, and they were not frivolous. If killing is sinful, a rule requiring it institutionalizes sin. If monastic life means withdrawal from the world, an order whose work is warfare is not monastic at all. And there was a specific practical worry. A religious order with its own army, answerable to nobody local, is a dangerous thing to create, and several churchmen said so at the time. Every one of those objections turned out to be well-founded, and the last one turned out to be the most prescient, though not in the way its authors expected, since the danger in the end fell on the Templars rather than proceeding from them. What saved them, and what turned a small band of escorts into an international institution, was that one of the most influential churchmen alive took up their case. Bernard of Clairvaux was, in the second quarter of the 12th century, probably the most powerful private individual in Western Europe. He held no crown and no bishopric. He was the abbot of a Cistercian monastery in Burgundy, and from that position he advised popes, rebuked kings, arbitrated disputes between kingdoms, preached a crusade, and shaped the spiritual temperature of an entire continent. He wrote constantly and with enormous force. When Bernard took a position, it tended to become the position. He was also, it should be said, capable of being spectacularly wrong. He preached the Second Crusade with enormous success, and the Second Crusade was a catastrophe that achieved nothing and destroyed 2 armies, after which he had to write a defence of himself, explaining that the failure was due to the sins of the participants rather than to any error in the enterprise. It is a familiar move. The man who supplied the theology of the Templars also supplied the theology of blaming the dead for losing. He was also, by family connection, close to the founding Templars. One of the original group appears to have been a relative, and in the late 1120s he was approached to lend his authority to the new brotherhood. He did more than lend it. He wrote a treatise, In Praise of the New Knighthood, which is one of the most consequential short works of the Middle Ages, and it did the thing that had to be done. It made theological sense of a warrior monk. The argument runs roughly as follows. The ordinary knight of Christendom, Bernard says with considerable contempt, is a vain and dangerous creature. A man who covers himself and his horse in silks and paint, grows his hair long, fights over insults and inheritances, and kills for pride. If he dies in sin. If he kills in sin. The whole enterprise of secular knighthood is a machine for damnation dressed in decoration. Bernard's contempt here is not a rhetorical pose. The knightly class of 12th century Europe was a genuine social problem. A caste of armed men trained for violence, with limited land to inherit, whose feuds and private wars caused continuous disorder. The Church had been trying to manage them for a century with mechanisms like the peace of God and the truce of God, which attempted to place limits on when and against whom violence could be used, with mixed success. The Crusade itself has been read by some historians as, among other things, an export solution to that problem, a way of pointing Europe's surplus violence outward. Whether or not that was anyone's conscious intention, the new knighthood was very obviously an attempt to civilize the warrior by giving him a rule and a purpose. The new knight is the opposite. He is dirty, unadorned, disciplined, and celibate. He does not fight for himself, but under obedience. And because the enemy he fights is the enemy of Christ, the killing he does is not homicide, but what Bernard called, in a phrase that has been troubling readers ever since, the killing of evil rather than the killing of a man. If he dies, he is a martyr. If he kills, he serves. It is a formidable piece of rhetoric and a genuinely uncomfortable document. It is worth being honest about that rather than skating past it. This is the text that supplies the theological justification for holy war as a form of religious devotion, written by a man the Church regards as a saint, and it was enormously effective. Whatever one thinks of it, and modern readers, including many Christian ones, find it difficult. It did what it was written to do. It made the Templars respectable. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, the order received formal church recognition and a written rule, drawn up with Bernard's involvement. The Latin rule laid out how these men were to live: the prayers, the meals, the discipline, the property, the silence. The poor fellow soldiers of the temple were no longer an improvisation. They were an institution with a constitution. And then Hugues de Payens went on tour. He travelled through France, England, and Scotland, recruiting and soliciting donations, carrying with him the authority of church approval and the endorsement of Bernard. The response was overwhelming. Land, money, horses, and men came in from every direction, and within a generation the order that had begun with 9 men sharing horses held property across the whole of Western Europe. The speed of it is genuinely striking. From a handful of knights with no standing in 1119, to formal recognition in 1129, to a papal charter granting near total autonomy in 1139. 20 years from obscurity to one of the most privileged institutions in Christendom. Nothing else in medieval Europe grew like that. It happened because the idea answered a need that the whole society felt, a way for the warrior class to be warriors without damnation, and a way for everyone else to participate in the crusade without going. There was also a recruitment reality behind it that the sources make plain. Medieval inheritance in much of Europe favoured the eldest son, which meant that noble families produced a steady supply of younger sons with training, status, and no land. Men who had been raised as knights and had no prospect of an estate. Those men were the traditional cause of a great deal of trouble, and they were also the Templars' natural recruits. The order offered them a life with structure, honour, purpose, and a guaranteed place, and it asked in return the three things they were least likely to obtain anyway: property, marriage, and independence. The popular image of a Templar is a man in a white surcoat with a red cross on horseback in the desert. That is accurate for a small minority of the order on a small minority of days. The reality of Templar life, for most members most of the time, was closer to that of a farm manager who prayed a great deal. The day was structured by the monastic hours, and it began in the dark. Matins was around 4 in the morning, sometimes earlier. The brothers rose, went to chapel, and recited or heard the office. Then they checked their horses and equipment, because that was written into the rule. After prayer, before sleep, see to the animals. Then back to bed, briefly, then up again for the morning offices. Prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline. The canonical hours punctuated the entire day, and a Templar was expected at all of them unless duty prevented it, in which case he said a set number of Our Fathers instead counted. That last provision is a small window into how the order actually worked. A brother in the field, or on the road, or sitting up with a sick horse, could not attend chapel. So the rule quantified the obligation and made it portable. 13 Our Fathers for Matins, 7 for each of the day hours, 9 for Vespers. A running account of prayer owed and paid, kept in the head, by men who are often nowhere near a church. It is the same instinct that produced their accounting system applied to the soul. Meals were taken in silence, or rather while a reading was given, because the rule held that the mouth should be occupied with spiritual food while the body ate. Brothers ate in pairs from shared dishes so that each could see the other was getting enough. An oddly touching provision. Meat was allowed 3 times a week, which was more generous than most monastic orders, on the reasoning that fighting men needed feeding. There was also a provision that says a good deal about the order's practical intelligence. Sick brothers were exempt from the fasting rules and were to be fed whatever the infirmary thought would restore them. Templar infirmaries in the East had a reputation for competence, and the order maintained hospitals as well as fortresses. The Hospitallers get the medical credit, reasonably, since it was their founding purpose. But the Templars ran a working medical establishment too, because an order that cannot keep its knights alive cannot field them. Wine was permitted in moderation. Fasting was frequent. Their possessions were minimal and specified. A Templar owned nothing personally. Everything was issued and could be taken back. He was forbidden decorative fittings on his equipment. No gold, no silver on the bridle or the stirrups, no ornamentation of any kind. His hair was cut short, and his beard was worn long, which was a deliberate inversion of the fashion of secular knights who wore their hair long and their faces shaved. A Templar was meant to be recognisable as a man who had renounced vanity. The white mantle itself carried meaning. White signified purity and was granted only to knight brothers. Sergeants wore black or brown. The red cross was added later by papal grant in 1147, and it marked the wearer as a man permitted, required, to shed blood in a cause the Church had blessed. The combination is one of the most recognisable images to come out of the Middle Ages, and it was designed to be a Templar was meant to be identifiable at a distance on a battlefield by both sides. chastity was absolute and enforced. The rule is explicit about avoiding the company of women, to the point of forbidding brothers to kiss any woman, including their own mothers and sisters. Letters could not be received or sent without permission and had to be read aloud to a superior. Hunting was banned, with one exception: lions, on the grounds that the lion prowls seeking whom he may devour and is therefore a legitimate spiritual as well as physical target. The rule is full of small provisions like that, and reading it is the fastest way to get a feel for the order as a lived institution rather than a legend. Brothers were not to wear pointed shoes or laces, because those were fashionable. They were not to have locks on their chests, because a brother owned nothing that needed hiding. A brother who broke something was to report it. A brother who lost his temper at table lost his wine. There is a provision governing what happens if a brother's horse gets loose, and one about not lending equipment without permission, and one about how to behave if you meet a brother of another order on the road. The rule grew by accretion over a century and a half, with new clauses added as new situations arose, until it ran to hundreds of articles covering nearly every eventuality a large organization of men living communally can generate. The whole document is the constitution of a large organization of men living together permanently, and most of it is concerned with the ordinary friction of that arrangement rather than with anything mystical. Discipline was severe and carefully graded, and the surviving penal code is one of the most revealing documents we have about the order's internal life. Offences were classified by gravity, with penalties ranging from a period of eating on the floor with the dogs, to loss of the habit for a term, to permanent expulsion. The gravest offences, those that resulted in expulsion, included heresy, murder of a Christian, theft, revealing the order's chapter proceedings, cowardice in battle, and, notably, desertion from the field. That last one is worth dwelling on. Templars in battle were forbidden to retreat unless the odds exceeded 3-1, and even then only with permission. A brother who fled while a Templar banner still flew forfeited the habit. If no Templar banner remained, he was to join the banner of another Christian order, and only if none remained at all could he honourably withdraw. This is not a rhetorical flourish. It was enforced, and it produced a fighting force with a reputation for standing when everyone else had gone, which won battles, and which also, on several catastrophic occasions, got the entire order killed. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued a bull called Omni Datum Optimum, and it is arguably the single most important document in Templar history. More important than the rule, and more important, in the long run, than any battle they fought. It granted the order a set of privileges so extensive that it effectively created a new kind of institution in Europe. 3 provisions mattered above all. First, the Templars answered to the Pope and to no one else. Not to kings, not to local bishops, not to any secular or ecclesiastical authority in whose territory they happened to hold land. A Templar house in England was not subject to the Archbishop of Canterbury. A Templar house in France was not, in any straightforward sense, subject to the King of France. They were an extraterritorial organisation with a single distant superior who was, in practice, rarely in a position to supervise them closely. Second, they were exempt from tithes, the church tax, and, in time, from most other forms of taxation. Not only exempt from paying, they were granted the right in many places to collect tithes themselves. An organisation that pays no tax and receives revenue is, over a century, going to accumulate an enormous amount of capital. Third, they were permitted their own chaplains, answerable to the order rather than to the local diocese. That is a small-sounding clause with very large consequences. It meant the Templars could hear confessions internally, bury their dead in their own ground, conduct their own religious life, and, crucially for what happened later, hold chapter meetings that no outsider attended and whose proceedings no outsider could compel them to reveal. Put those three together and you have an autonomous, tax-exempt, internationally distributed, self-policing organisation with its own clergy, its own courts of internal discipline, its own armed forces, and no local accountability whatsoever. There had never been anything quite like it. There would not be anything quite like it again until the modern multinational corporation, and the comparison is closer than it sounds. Consider the parallels honestly. An entity operating across many jurisdictions, subject to none of them in the ordinary way, with a single distant governing authority, paying no local taxes, holding assets and moving capital internationally, employing local labour while its decision-making sits elsewhere, and generating persistent resentment among the authorities in whose territory it operates but who cannot reach it. That is a recognisable modern shape, and the medieval version produced exactly the same complaints. That it drained wealth out of the locality, answered to nobody, and used its exemptions to undercut everyone bound by the ordinary rules. The privileges were resented immediately. Bishops complained continuously across the 12th and 13th centuries about Templar houses that ignored their authority, buried people they had not authorized, and collected revenue they regarded as theirs. One recurring grievance is worth mentioning because it shows how the privileges worked at ground level. The Templars had the right to open their churches once a year in places under interdict. The church's collective punishment that suspended services for an entire community, and to collect the offerings. To a bishop trying to discipline a town, an organisation that could ignore his interdict and profit from doing so was intolerable. To the townspeople, the Templars were the only people who would bury their dead. Both reactions were entirely rational, and neither could be reconciled. Local clergy grumbled. Secular lords grumbled. The grumbling was constant, and for a long time it did not matter, because the Templars had the Pope, and the Pope was enough. Until, one day, the Pope was not enough. But that is 200 years away. What happened next is the part of the story that is least dramatic and most important. Europe gave them everything. Between roughly 1130 and 1250, donations flowed to the Templars on a scale that is genuinely difficult to convey. Kings gave them estates. Nobles gave them manors, mills, villages, and rights of pasture. Ordinary landowners gave them fields. Merchants gave them houses in towns. Some of it was outright gift. Some was granted in exchange for prayers. Some in exchange for the donor's admission to the order in old age. Some as a form of spiritual insurance against a life spent doing things the church disapproved of. The motives were mixed and entirely medieval. Giving land to a religious order was understood as an investment in one's soul, and giving it to an order fighting for the Holy Land was the most direct form of participation in the crusade available to someone who could not or would not go. A man who could not leave his estates for 3 years to march to Jerusalem could instead give the Templars a manor, and the Templars would fight on his behalf, and the merit would be shared. It was, in a real sense, crusading by proxy. There is a further motive that the documents make plain and that a modern reader can find genuinely strange. A significant number of donors gave land in return for a promise of burial in Templar ground and a share in the prayers of the order. Templar cemeteries were considered spiritually advantageous places to lie, and being buried among men who had died fighting for Christ was understood to confer real benefit on the soul. Some donors arranged to enter the order themselves in old age, taking vows on their deathbed and giving everything they had, which the order permitted and which, unsurprisingly, its critics found suspicious. The result was a property portfolio spanning the whole of Latin Christendom. The Templars held land in France in enormous quantity, in England, in Scotland and Ireland, in Iberia, in Germany, in Italy, in Hungary, in the Crusader states themselves. Estimates of the total number of properties run into the thousands. In England alone, the order held something in the region of 500 properties. In France, considerably more. The scale meant that in many regions an ordinary person would have encountered the Templars not as warriors but as landlords. The institution that collected the rent, ran the mill, held the market rights, and enjoyed exemptions from dues that everyone else paid. That is not a recipe for popular affection, and when the arrests came in 1307 there is very little sign of public sympathy anywhere. They held whole districts of major cities. In London, the Temple district retains the name to this day, along with the round church they built there. In Paris, the Temple enclosure was a fortified precinct, effectively outside royal jurisdiction, with its own tower, its own walls, and its own population. All of this had to be administered, and the administrative system is what most Templars actually did with their lives. The basic unit was the preceptory or commandery, a house, usually with a chapel, managing the agricultural estates around it. A preceptory might have a handful of brothers, often a couple of knights, several sergeants, a chaplain, and a body of hired labour and tenants. And its job was to run the farms, collect the rents, manage the flocks, and generate a surplus. That surplus, called the responsion, was the whole point. Each Western house was required to send a proportion of its annual income, conventionally a third, east to fund the war. The collection and transmission of that share was the central administrative task of the entire order, and it produced a hierarchy to manage it. Preceptories reporting to regional commanderies, commanderies reporting to a master for each kingdom or province, provincial masters reporting to the Grand Master and the central convent in the east. It is, structurally, a modern organisational chart, and it existed because the money had to move reliably across a continent every year for 200 years. Everything else was structure supporting that pipeline. The Templar network across Europe was, functionally, a machine for converting European agricultural production into castles, horses, weapons, and wages in the Holy Land. It is worth appreciating what an unusual arrangement that was for the period. Medieval economies were overwhelmingly local. Most produce was consumed within a few days' travel of where it was grown, and moving surplus over long distances was difficult and expensive. The Templars built a system that reliably extracted value from thousands of scattered estates across a dozen kingdoms and delivered it, year after year, to a war 2,000 kilometres away. That required accounting, transport, shipping, currency exchange, and management across enormous distances. Administrative capabilities that few institutions in Europe possessed and that no secular state of the period could match. And that, incidentally, is the answer to a question people often ask about the Order's supposed treasure. The Templars were enormously wealthy in assets and permanently short of liquid money, because the money kept being spent on a war that consumed everything and produced nothing. Holding a war effort in the Eastern Mediterranean was ruinously expensive. Castles cost fortunes to build and more to garrison. Horses died. Men had to be shipped, fed, and armed. The Order was rich in the way a great landowner is rich, and poor in the way anyone funding a permanent overseas military commitment is poor. A single war horse of the quality a Templar knight required cost the equivalent of many years of a labourer's wages, and each knight was entitled to several. Armour had to be made, maintained, and replaced. Shipping a horse across the Mediterranean was an expensive and dangerous operation in itself, and a proportion of animals died on the voyage. Multiply that across a standing establishment maintained for 2 centuries, and the arithmetic of Templar poverty becomes clear enough. Somewhere in the middle of the 12th century, the Templars began doing something nobody had done at that scale before, and it grew into the most sophisticated financial operation in Europe. The problem it solved was simple and universal. A pilgrim setting out from, say, Toulouse for Jerusalem faced a journey of many months through territories with different laws, currencies, and levels of security. He needed money for the entire journey. Carrying it meant carrying gold and silver on his person across a continent full of bandits, which was, in practical terms, an invitation to be robbed and quite possibly killed. The Templar solution: deposit the money at a Templar house before departure, receive a document recording the deposit, travel with nothing worth stealing, and withdraw the equivalent at a Templar house at the destination. The order had houses everywhere along the route and at the far end. It had secure buildings, armed men, and internal accounting. And it had an institutional reputation that made the paper credible. That is, in essence, a letter of credit. And, in effect, a traveller's checkway. It required a system of encoding and verification that has not survived in detail, since the documents were not meant to outlive their use, but it functioned, and it functioned across enormous distances, and it appears to have been reliable. The trust question is the interesting one. Any such system depends on the receiving house believing the document, and on nobody being able to forge it. We do not know precisely how they solved that. The working papers are gone, but the essential ingredients are visible. A closed organisation with internal accounting, brothers who could be identified and vouched for, a common language of record, and, above all, the reputational stake of an institution that would still exist next year. That last item is what makes banking possible at all, then and now. A letter of credit is worth exactly what you believe about the organisation that issued it. From there, the business expanded in every direction that a modern reader will find familiar. The Templars accepted deposits from nobles and monarchs for safekeeping, which made their strongholds the safest vaults in Europe. They managed estates and revenues on behalf of clients. They collected taxes and papal levies. They transferred funds internationally. They made loans, structuring them to avoid the Church's prohibition on usury, typically by charging a fee for the service or by taking the revenues of a pledged property in place of interest, arrangements that everyone understood and that satisfied the letter of canon law. They became the bankers of kings. The French crown's treasury was for a considerable period physically housed in the Paris Temple, and Templar officials effectively functioned as royal financial officers. The English crown used them similarly. The papacy used them to move money across Europe. In the 13th century, if you were a European monarch and you needed a large sum transferred securely from one country to another, there was really only one organisation that could do it. The scale of that involvement can be measured in a specific way. When Philip IV needed to flee a Paris riot in 1306, caused by his own currency debasement, he took refuge in the temple because it was the strongest building in the city and because he was on comfortable terms with the men inside it. He spent several days there under Templar protection. 15 months later, he arrested every one of them. 2 consequences follow from this, and both matter enormously for the end of the story. The first is that the Templars became indispensable to the very rulers who would later destroy them, which gave them a false sense of security. Being the king's banker feels like protection. It is not. It also produced a specific vulnerability that is easy to miss. When the Crown's treasury sits in your building and your officers administer royal revenue, you become intimately familiar with the king's finances, which debts he cannot pay, which expedients he has resorted to, how bad it actually is. There is a general rule about that kind of knowledge. It makes you useful right up until the moment it makes you dangerous. The second is that they became, in the eyes of a great many people, something other than the humble order Bernard had praised. Men sworn to poverty were now running Europe's most powerful financial institution. The contradiction was noted at the time, frequently and sharply. It did not make them corrupt. Individual Templars still owned nothing, but it made them a target for resentment, and resentment is the raw material that political destruction is made from. While the European houses generated money, the Eastern houses spent it, and most of what they spent it on was stone. The Crusader states had a permanent structural problem. They never had enough men. The Latin population of Outremer was small. A ruling class and a settler community numbering in the tens of thousands spread thinly along a coastal strip, surrounded by populations and powers vastly larger. Field armies could be raised, but they were precious and could not be replaced quickly. A single lost battle could cost a kingdom a generation of manpower. The answer to too few men is fortification. A castle multiplies the value of every soldier in it. 20 men behind good walls can hold a position that would require hundreds in the open, and a chain of such positions controls territory that a field army could never permanently occupy. So the Crusader states built, and the military orders became their principal builders, because the orders had the one thing the secular lords lacked: a continuous income from Europe that did not depend on the harvest or the succession of a local lordship. The Templars held a network of fortresses across the Holy Land. Safed in Galilee, rebuilt at enormous expense in the 13th century, was one of the great strongholds of the region. Atlit. Chateau Pellerin, the pilgrim's castle, was built on a promontory south of Haifa in 1218, with the sea on 3 sides, and it was never taken by assault in its entire history. Bagras guarded the pass into Antioch. Tortosa, Sidon, Gaza, Beaufort, and a string of smaller towers and fortified farms filled in the network. The Hospitallers, their sister order and rival, held Crac de Chevaliers, which is the most famous Crusader castle in the world and among the best preserved. Crac is worth a sentence on its own. 2 concentric rings of walls on a spur commanding a strategic pass, with a sloped stone glacis at the base of the inner wall that makes mining and escalade almost impossible. Storerooms cut for a garrison of 2,000, and a great hall with Gothic tracery that would not be out of place in France. It was never taken by assault in nearly 2 centuries. It fell in 1271 to a Mamluk siege that ended, according to the standard account, with a forged letter instructing the garrison to surrender. These were not the small square keeps of early medieval Europe. Crusader castle architecture developed rapidly under pressure and under the influence of Byzantine and Islamic military engineering, and it produced structures of real sophistication, concentric walls, so that an attacker who breached the outer ring found himself in a killing ground overlooked by the inner one, projecting towers allowing defenders to shoot along the face of the wall, bent entrances that prevented a battering ram from being run straight at a gate, enormous cisterns and storerooms for sieges lasting months. Garrisoning them was the difficulty. A castle like Safed needed a substantial permanent staff. Knights, sergeants, crossbowmen, servants, craftsmen, labourers, and the cost of maintaining that establishment year after year was crushing. Templar records and chronicle accounts give figures for garrisons and running costs that make clear the order was operating at the edge of what its European revenues could support permanently. The castles were both the solution to the manpower problem and a slow financial bleed that no amount of donated land could fully staunch. And they were vulnerable in a way that is easy to forget. A castle can only be held if there is a field army somewhere capable of relieving it. A fortress that cannot be relieved is not a stronghold. It is a container in which a garrison waits to be starved or mined out. After Hatton destroyed the field army of Jerusalem, the castles fell one after another over the following months, not because their walls failed, but because there was nobody left outside to break a siege. The Mamluks would repeat the lesson methodically in the 13th century. The Templar reputation in battle rested on one thing above all: they did not break. Medieval battles were usually decided not by casualties but by cohesion. Armies did not fight to annihilation. They fought until one side's formation came apart, at which point the killing began in earnest as the losers were ridden down in flight. The critical military quality, therefore, was the ability of a body of men to hold together under pressure. And that is precisely what a monastic order with an enforced disciplinary code could deliver better than a feudal levy of proud individuals. The Templar tactical specialty was the heavy cavalry charge, delivered in close order at a chosen moment. A charge of armoured knights on armoured horses, arriving together rather than piecemeal, was one of the most powerful weapons on any medieval battlefield. The difficulty was always in the coordination. The physics of it are worth appreciating. A knight and his horse in full equipment weighed something in the region of half a ton, moving at perhaps 30 kilometres an hour, with a lance held braced. A line of them arriving simultaneously delivers an impact that infantry of the period had almost no reliable answer to, provided the line holds together and provided the target cannot get out of the way. Both of those provisos matter enormously, and Muslim armies built around mounted archers had worked out that the answer to a heavy charge is simply not to be there when it arrives. Secular knights charged when their honour moved them, which was frequently too early. Templars charged when ordered, in formation, and stopped and reformed when ordered, which is far harder and far more effective. Their rule governed this in detail. Brothers were assigned to squadrons under a commander. Leaving formation without permission was a punishable offence. The marshal carried the piebald banner, black above, white below, called the Beauchamp, a name of uncertain derivation, debated even in the Middle Ages, with one tradition holding that the black stood for the sin the brothers had left behind, and the white for the purity they had entered, and another that it referred simply to a piebald horse. And the rule was that as long as the banner flew, no brother could leave the field. If the marshal fell, another took the banner. If the Templar banner fell entirely, brothers were to rally to the banner of the Hospitallers or any other Christian order still standing. Only if none remained might they honourably withdraw. The consequence was a force that could be relied on to be exactly where it was put for as long as it was needed, and that would die rather than run. Muslim chroniclers, who had no motive to flatter them, described the military orders as the hardest element of any Crusader army, and note that their capture was regarded as different from the capture of ordinary knights. That difference had a grim edge. Because the orders were sworn to permanent war and could not be ransomed, their rule forbade paying ransom for a brother on the grounds that it would incentivize capture and drain the treasury. Templar and Hospitaller prisoners were of no financial value to their captors. They were also from a Muslim commander's perspective, the most dangerous men to release. The predictable result was that captured Templars were frequently executed after battles, and both sides understood this as the normal arrangement rather than as an atrocity. There is one further point that complicates the popular image, and it is worth making. The Templars in the field were not fanatics in the sense of being reckless. Their rule made them cautious in exactly the ways that inexperienced crusaders from Europe were not. They knew the terrain. They understood the tactical realities of fighting mounted archers who would not stand and receive a charge. And on multiple occasions the Templar leadership argued for restraint against newly arrived Western nobles hungry for glory. Sometimes they were overruled, and sometimes the results were catastrophic. And sometimes this too is honest history. The Templars themselves pushed for battles that should not have been fought. There were victories, and the greatest of them was Montgazard. In November 1177, Saladin, who had by then unified Egypt and Syria, and was the most formidable opponent the Crusader states ever faced, invaded the Kingdom of Jerusalem with a large army, expecting little resistance. The kingdom's forces were divided and far to the north. The road to Jerusalem was effectively open. What met him instead, near Montgazard in the coastal plain, was a scratch force assembled at speed under the King of Jerusalem, Baldwin IV, a young man of about 16 who suffered from leprosy, whose reign is one of the more remarkable stories of the period, and who led his army in person despite a disease that was already destroying his hands. With him were a body of Templars, perhaps 80 knights, under their Grand Master. Saladin's army was strung out and unprepared, moving in the confidence of an uncontested advance. The Crusader force caught them in that condition and charged. The Templars, in the accounts, went in as a formed wedge and broke straight through towards Saladin's guard. The Muslim army collapsed. Saladin escaped with a fraction of his force and a hard journey back to Egypt. Montgazard was a genuine and improbable victory, and it made the Templar reputation in Europe. Here was the proof of Bernard's argument. A small body of disciplined religious knights, outnumbered enormously, breaking a great army. Donations surged. Recruitment surged. It also, arguably, did lasting damage, because it taught a generation that the odds did not matter, that discipline and faith could overcome any numerical disadvantage, and that the aggressive option was the pious one. Bernard's theology had a role in that. If the Templar is fighting God's war, and if death in that war is martyrdom rather than defeat, then the calculus of risk changes in a way that is spiritually coherent and militarily dangerous. A commander who believes that losing is a form of winning will take engagements that a commander who believes only in winning would decline. That lesson would be applied 10 years later in circumstances where it was catastrophically wrong. On the 4th of July 1187, on a scrubby hill in Galilee with 2 rocky summits, the Kingdom of Jerusalem destroyed itself. The background is a story of political failure. Baldwin IV had died young, worn out by his disease. The succession collapsed into faction. The kingdom split between a party urging caution towards Saladin, led by Raymond of Tripoli, who had negotiated truces and understood the balance of force, and a party urging aggression, which included the new king, Guy of Lusignan, the reckless Lord Raynald of Chatillon, whose raids on caravans had broken a truce and given Saladin his justification for war, and the Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Rydefort. Rydefort is one of the more consequential bad decisions in medieval history, personified. Earlier that year, he had led a small Templar force into a hopeless engagement at the Springs of Cresson against overwhelming odds, against advice, and had lost almost the entire force. Some 60 knights of the order killed, with Rydfort himself among the handful who escaped. He appears to have learned nothing from it. There is a personal dimension to Rydfort that the chronicles record and that historians treat with caution but cannot dismiss. Before joining the order, he had been a secular knight in the service of Raymond of Tripoli, and had been promised the hand of an heiress whom Raymond then married to somebody else, a wealthy Italian merchant in the account. Rydfort reportedly took the Templar habit in the aftermath. Whether that grievance shaped his opposition to Raymond's counsel 20 years later is unknowable, and the story may be a chronicler's tidy explanation. But it was believed at the time, and it is a reminder that the decisions that destroyed a kingdom were made by men with histories. In the summer of 1187, Saladin invaded with a very large army and besieged Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, where Raymond of Tripoli's wife was in the citadel. The Crusader army mustered at Sepphoris, at a good position with abundant water. The strategic question was whether to march to relieve Tiberias across 20 kilometres of waterless country in July, or to stay at the springs and force Saladin to come to them. Raymond, whose own wife was in the besieged castle, argued to stay. He said, in the accounts, that Tiberias was his and his wife was in it, and he would rather lose both than see the army destroyed. It was the correct assessment. The council initially agreed. The reasoning behind it was straightforward, and everyone in the tent could follow it. Saladin's army was large, and large armies in that country have a supply problem. They cannot sit in front of a fortified position indefinitely. If the Crusaders stayed at the springs of Sepphoris with water and grazing, Saladin had two choices: attack a prepared position at a disadvantage, or withdraw. Tiberias would be lost either way, but the field army, the only thing standing between Saladin and the entire kingdom, would survive. Raymond was proposing to trade a castle and his own wife for a kingdom, and he said so out loud. That night, Rydfort went to the king's tent privately and argued the opposite, that remaining was cowardice, that Raymond's advice was suspect, that the army should march. By morning, the decision was reversed. They marched into a waterless plateau in the heat of a Galilean July, harassed the entire way by mounted archers who would not close and could not be caught. By evening, the army was exhausted and desperate with thirst, and it halted short of the water on the plateau near a hill called the Horns of Hatton. Saladin's forces surrounded them and set fire to the dry scrub upwind, so the Crusaders spent the night in smoke, without water, listening to their enemies moving in the dark. The battle the next day was less a battle than a dissolution. The infantry broke away toward the Sea of Galilee in search of water and were cut off. The knights made repeated charges that failed to break the encirclement. Raymond of Tripoli led a charge that punched through, Saladin's line reportedly opening to let him pass and closing behind him, and escaped, an act that his enemies called treachery, and that was more probably a commander recognizing a lost field. By the end of the day, the royal army of Jerusalem had ceased to exist. The king was captured. The true cross, carried into battle as the kingdom's holiest relic, was taken. The loss of the relic mattered more to contemporaries than the loss of the army. The true cross had been carried before the host of Jerusalem for 80 years. It was the kingdom's talisman and the visible sign of divine favour. Its capture was read on both sides as a verdict. It was never recovered, despite repeated attempts to negotiate for it, and what became of it is unknown. Saladin's treatment of the prisoners is well documented and revealing about the period. The king he treated with courtesy, giving him iced water in a famous scene. Raynald of Chatillon, the truce breaker, he executed personally, and the captured Templars and Hospitallers, some 200 of them, he had put to death because they could not be ransomed and would never stop fighting. It was, by the logic of the time, a strategic decision rather than a cruelty, and both sides had done the same in the other direction. Saladin's own reputation deserves a sentence of clarification here because it has been through two opposite distortions. In 19th century European Romanticism, he became the chivalrous Saracen, courteous and merciful, largely as a device for criticizing the Crusaders. In some modern polemic, he becomes the reverse. The historical figure was a highly capable ruler and general who could be genuinely magnanimous when it served policy and reputation, and entirely ruthless when it did not, which describes almost every successful commander of the period on both sides. He was neither the gentle knight of Walter Scott nor a monster. Within 3 months, Jerusalem had fallen. The city surrendered on terms after a short siege, and Saladin's conduct there was notably restrained by the standards of 1099. The inhabitants were permitted to ransom themselves, and many who could not pay were released anyway. The negotiation itself is well recorded. The defence was led by Balian of Ibelin, who at one point told Saladin that if terms were refused, the defenders would destroy the city's holy places and kill their own families before dying in the breach. A threat that was credible enough to move the discussion. Terms were agreed at a fixed ransom per person, and when it became clear that thousands could not pay, Saladin's brother asked for a number of them as a gift and immediately freed them, and Saladin did the same, and the patriarch of the city left with his own wealth intact while poor Christians were sold into slavery, which contemporaries on the Christian side noted with disgust. The contrast between the two captures of the same city, 88 years apart, was noted at the time and has been noted ever since. The Templars had been at the centre of the disaster. Their Grand Master had argued for the march that destroyed the army. Their brothers had died in it in large numbers, and the thing they had been founded to protect, the pilgrim roads to Jerusalem, no longer led to a Christian city. That is worth sitting with, because it is the first version of the crisis that would eventually kill them. An organisation created for a specific task lost the ability to perform that task in 1187 and continued for another 127 years. It survived by redefining the mission as recovery rather than protection. The roads would be reopened, the city retaken, and in the meantime the war itself was the work. That redefinition held as long as recovery seemed plausible. When Acre fell and plausibility ended, there was nothing left to redefine into. The kingdom is lost, and before we follow the order through the century of trying to get it back, the story pauses here, in the aftermath, on a night in the Judean hills. It is late, and the heat has gone out of the day at last. In the desert, the temperature drops fast once the sun is down, and the stone that was too hot to touch at noon is cool by midnight and cold by dawn. The land holds the shape of the day in it and gives it up slowly. The hills run in long bare folds toward the east, pale under starlight, cut by wadies full of shadow. Nothing grows here that does not have to. There are thorn bushes in the dry watercourses and low scrub on the slopes, and a smell of dust and hot stone and something aromatic that only releases at night. A jackal calls somewhere down the valley, and another answers, further off, and then the silence comes back and is enormous. Above, the sky is doing what desert skies do when there is nothing on the ground to interfere. The stars are not scattered but layered, thousands of them, down to a horizon so dark you cannot tell where the land ends. the same stars the pilgrims steered by, the same stars over Jerusalem, a day's ride west, where the walls are held now by different men and the roads are quiet. Somewhere on those roads the caravans still move at night, as they always have, because the nights are cool and the days are not. A line of camels going slowly along a track worn by 10,000 years of feet, the bells muffled, the drivers not speaking. They have been crossing this country since long before any of the people in this story were born, and they will keep crossing it long after every fortress on the coast has fallen. There is a great quiet in that, and a great rest. The battle is over. The men who fought it are dead, or in chains, or riding home in the dark, and in 100 years they will all be gone, and the hills will look exactly as they look tonight. Rest here a while, in the cool of the desert, under those enormous stars, with the dust settling on the road and the whole long argument about who holds Jerusalem laid aside until morning. Down in the wadi, something small moves in the stones and stops. The air has that particular dryness that carries sound a long way, so a rock dislodged 1/2 kilometre off arrives clearly, and then there is nothing again. The bells of the caravan come and go with the shape of the ground. Toward the east, the land falls away toward the Dead Sea and the Jordan Valley. And beyond that, the hills of Moab stand as a darker line against the stars, the way they have stood through every empire that ever crossed this country. What followed Hattin was 104 years of attempting to undo it, and the Templars were at the centre of every attempt. The Third Crusade came first, and it was the great effort. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, 3 of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, all taking the cross. Barbarossa drowned crossing a river in Anatolia, and his army largely dissolved. Philip came, took part in the recapture of Acre, and went home early, having quarrelled with Richard, and having realised that his interests were better served in France. Richard stayed, won battles, negotiated with Saladin, came within sight of Jerusalem twice, and turned back both times because he understood something the poets did not. Taking the city was possible, holding it after the crusading armies went home was not. The treaty Richard concluded in 1192 left the Christians a coastal strip and a right of pilgrimage to Jerusalem. It was, in cold terms, a reasonable outcome from a difficult position. In emotional terms, it was a failure, because Jerusalem was the point and Jerusalem was not recovered. The Templars adapted to a new reality. Their headquarters moved to Acre, which became the effective capital of what remained of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Their castles were rebuilt where possible and abandoned where not. They fought in the campaigns that followed. The Fifth Crusade in Egypt, the Crusade of Frederick II, the disastrous expedition of Louis IX of France that ended with a French king in captivity. And their casualties in those decades were severe. At the Battle of La Forbie in 1244, a defeat comparable to Hattin in scale, the Templar contingent was almost entirely destroyed. Of some 300 knights present, a handful survived. La Forbie is barely remembered now, and it deserves to be, because it finished what Hattin started. The Christian field army in Palestine was destroyed alongside its allies. The military orders lost the bulk of their fighting strength in a single afternoon, and the kingdom never again fielded a force capable of offensive operations. Everything after 1244 is defensive, and everything defensive in that region ends the same way. That was the pattern of the 13th century. The order would rebuild, recruit, replace its dead, and lose them again in the next catastrophe. And replacement was becoming harder. Recruitment depended on European enthusiasm for the crusade, and that enthusiasm was declining decade by decade as the news from the East got worse. An order that loses 300 knights in an afternoon needs a generation of donations and volunteers to rebuild, and the generation was not arriving. By the second half of the 13th century, the Templars in the East were an aging force topped up by whatever Europe would still send, defending a shrinking territory against an enemy that was getting stronger. Each cycle drew more resources from Europe and returned less, and the strategic situation was deteriorating in ways no amount of courage could address. The Muslim world was consolidating. The Ayyubid successors of Saladin gave way to the Mamluks of Egypt, a military caste of extraordinary effectiveness. Under commanders like Baybars, who systematically dismantled the Crusader states fortress by fortress. Meanwhile, the Mongol invasions swept through the region, destroying the old order and briefly raising Crusader hopes of an alliance against Islam, before the Mamluks stopped the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260 and turned their full attention back to the coast. The Templars were not alone, and their relationships with those around them are a large part of why the end came as it did. The Knights Hospitaller had begun earlier as a hospital order caring for sick pilgrims in Jerusalem and had militarized in imitation of the Templars. They were similar in structure, similar in privilege, and in permanent competition for the same donations, the same recruits, and the same influence. The rivalry was real and sometimes bitter. There are recorded instances of the two orders taking opposite sides in local disputes, and the chronicles complain about it regularly. At its worst, it went beyond complaint. There were occasions in the 13th century when Templars and Hospitallers backed rival claimants in succession disputes within the Crusader states, and at least one episode of open fighting between the orders in the streets of Acre. Contemporary observers found it scandalous, and said so. Two orders of monks, sworn to defend Christendom, brawling over local politics in the last Christian city on the mainland. When European critics later argued that the Holy Land had been lost through the pride and division of the military orders, this is what they were pointing at, and the criticism was not baseless. The obvious solution, repeatedly proposed and repeatedly refused, was to merge them. Both orders resisted, each preferring the arrangement in which it survived independently. The Teutonic Knights formed later, from a German hospital at Acre, and eventually found their vocation not in the Holy Land but on the Baltic frontier, where they carved out a state of their own in Prussia and Livonia. That is worth noting, because it demonstrates the alternative path available to a military order whose original war was ending. Find a new frontier and become a territorial power. The Templars never did this, and the failure to do it may have been fatal. Relations with the Muslim powers were more complicated than the popular image allows. The Templars were, of necessity, diplomats. They negotiated truces, exchanged prisoners, paid and received tribute, and maintained working relationships with neighbouring emirs that were sometimes cordial. They employed Arabic-speaking interpreters and had a practical understanding of regional politics that newly arrived crusaders lacked and often resented. There is a famous passage in the memoirs of Usama ibn Munkidh, a Syrian nobleman of the 12th century who knew the Crusaders well, describing his visits to Jerusalem where the Templars, whom he calls his friends, would clear a space for him to pray in the Al-Aqsa mosque that served as their headquarters, and would intervene when a newly arrived Frank, unfamiliar with the arrangement, tried to force him to face east. It is a small anecdote and a revealing one. The Templars are the ones who understand, and the newcomer is the fanatic. Usama's memoirs are among the most valuable sources for the period precisely because he is not writing propaganda. He is an aristocrat recording anecdotes, often with amusement, about neighbours he found by turns admirable, ridiculous, and barbaric. His observations on Frankish medicine are famously scathing. His observations on Frankish justice are baffled, and his account of the Templars is consistently the most positive thing he has to say about any group of crusaders, which tells you something about what 2 centuries of proximity actually produced. That practical tolerance was noticed at home and did not always play well. Accusations that the military orders were too comfortable with the enemy, too willing to make truces, too invested in a permanent state of manageable conflict rather than final victory, circulated in Europe throughout the 13th century. Some of it was slander. Some of it was a reasonable observation about the incentives of any organisation whose existence depends on a war continuing. The end of the Crusader states, when it came at Acre, and it took 6 weeks. By 1291, the Kingdom of Jerusalem consisted of a handful of coastal cities. Acre was the largest and the capital. A wealthy, crowded, cosmopolitan port with a population in the tens of thousands, divided into quarters controlled by the Italian merchant republics and the military orders, notoriously fractious and poorly governed. Its defences were formidable: double walls, a dozen major towers, and the sea at its back. The pretext for the final assault came from a massacre of Muslim merchants in the city by newly arrived crusaders from Italy, whom the city's own authorities could not control. The Mamluk Sultan demanded the perpetrators. The city refused to hand them over. In April 1291, an enormous Mamluk army arrived with siege engines on a scale the region had not seen, and began the systematic reduction of the walls. The siege lasted from early April to the 18th of May. Mining and bombardment brought down tower after tower. Relief did not come. Europe had lost interest, and the powers that might have sent help were occupied elsewhere. On the final day, the Mamluks broke through the accursed tower and into the city. What followed was a fighting withdrawal to the sea and a massacre of those who could not reach the boats. The Templar Grand Master, Guillaume de Beaujeu, was mortally wounded in the fighting at the walls. The account of his death describes him being carried away and telling those who thought he was abandoning the fight that he was not running. He was dead. The Templar compound in the city, a fortress within a fortress on the seaward side, held out for another 10 days after the rest had fallen. Refugees crowded inside it. A negotiated surrender was arranged and then broke down in violence. The account of what happened is confused, as such accounts are, but the outline is that a Mamluk detachment entered the compound under the terms and behaved badly toward the women and children sheltering there, whereupon the Templars killed them and repudiated the surrender. The Sultan then offered terms a second time. The Templar marshal went out to negotiate, and he and his party were seized and executed in view of the defenders. After that, there was nothing to negotiate. The Mamluks undermined the walls, and when the final assault came, the weakened structure collapsed, burying attackers and defenders together. That was the end. The remaining coastal positions were evacuated, or fell within weeks. Atlit, the great Templar castle that had never been taken, was abandoned in August because there was no longer anything to defend and no one to defend it with. Its ruins are still there on the coast south of Haifa, on the promontory, inside a military zone and largely inaccessible. The walls that were never breached are standing in the sea air and have been for 800 years. 2 centuries of Christian rule on the Levantine mainland ended, and the survivors sailed for Cyprus. The scale of what was lost is easy to understate. Acre had been one of the wealthiest ports in the Mediterranean, a hub where European, Levantine, and Asian trade met, with a population that included Italians, Franks, Syrian Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Its markets and its harbour dues had underwritten the Crusader states for a century. When it went, the entire economic basis of the Latin East went with it, along with the archives, the relics, and a great part of the accumulated wealth of 200 years. The fall of Acre created a problem that nobody in the order seems to have solved, and it is the deepest cause of everything that followed. The Templars existed for one purpose. Every privilege they held, every donation they received, every exemption from tax and episcopal authority rested on a single justification. They fought for the Holy Land. After 1291, there was no Holy Land to fight for. The order relocated its headquarters to Cyprus, kept its fleet, kept its estates, kept its wealth, and continued to collect the responsions from Europe. But the war those responsions funded had ended. There was also a specific and awkward problem on Cyprus itself. The Templars had briefly owned the island outright, having bought it from Richard the Lionheart after the Third Crusade, and had then sold it on within a year after their heavy-handed administration provoked a revolt they suppressed with considerable violence. Returning there a century later as guests of the Lusignan kings put them in a kingdom where their history was remembered, and where a powerful, wealthy, autonomous military order without a war was regarded by the crown as a problem rather than an asset. Relations were poor. The order was not welcome anywhere it went after 1291. For a while, this did not seem final. Everyone assumed a new crusade would come. Plans were drafted continuously through the 1290s and 1300s. Popes called for expeditions. Strategists wrote treatises on how the recovery should be organised. The Templars participated in this planning and mounted small operations, including the occupation of a tiny island off the Syrian coast that was held for a few years and then lost. But the great expedition never materialised, because the political will in Europe had gone. Kings were building states and fighting each other. The crusading enthusiasm that had emptied Europe of knights in 1096 had, by 1300, largely become a rhetorical gesture. The shift is measurable in where crusading energy actually went. Crusades continued to be preached and fought throughout the 13th century. Against the Cathars in southern France, against pagans on the Baltic frontier, against political enemies of the papacy in Italy, against Muslim powers in Iberia. What had ended was the specific idea that Western Europe would mount a great combined expedition to recover Jerusalem. The vocabulary survived, the destination changed, and an order defined exclusively by that destination was left behind by its own movement. Meanwhile, the order's public position deteriorated in a specific and dangerous way. Consider how it looked from the outside. Here was an organisation that had been given enormous wealth and unique legal privileges in exchange for defending Jerusalem. It had lost Jerusalem. It had then lost everything else. And it still had the wealth and still had the privileges, and its members still paid no taxes, still answered to no bishop, and still held their meetings in secret. Criticism became sharp. Chroniclers accused the orders of pride, greed, and of having lost the Holy Land through their own rivalries. The failure to merge the Templars and Hospitallers was cited repeatedly as a cause of defeat. Proposals for a forced merger circulated at the highest levels, and in 1306 Pope Clement V wrote to the masters of both orders asking for their views on the question. Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Templars, replied with a memorandum arguing against it. That reply, in hindsight, is a small tragedy. Molay's arguments were not unreasonable. He pointed out that competition drove recruitment and donations, and that the orders had different traditions. But the effect was to leave the Templars standing alone, without allies, at precisely the moment when someone was deciding what to do about them. Philip IV of France, called Philip the Fair for his appearance rather than his conduct, is the other main character in this story, and understanding him is essential. He came to the throne in 1285 and ruled for nearly 30 years, and he was one of the architects of the modern state. Under Philip, France developed a professional bureaucracy of trained lawyers, a systematic approach to royal authority, and an assertion of the crown's supremacy over every rival institution within the kingdom, including the church. He was cold, methodical, deeply pious in his own understanding, and utterly ruthless about anything that stood between the crown and its objectives. Contemporaries found him unreadable. One bishop described him as neither a man nor a beast, but a statue, a remark that has stuck to him for 7 centuries because it captures something everyone noticed, an absence of visible reaction. He rarely spoke in council. He surrounded himself with lawyers of exceptional ability, chief among them Guillaume de Nogaret, who had led the assault on Pope Boniface and who managed the Templar prosecution, and it has never been fully settled how much of royal policy originated with the king and how much with his ministers. The distinction may matter less than it appears. Whether Philip conceived the Templar operation or Nogaret did, the king authorized it, sustained it for 7 years against papal resistance, and personally ordered the final burnings within hours of the retraction. A ruler who consistently approves what his ministers propose is not being manipulated. He is governing through them. He was also permanently and desperately short of money. The reasons were structural. Philip fought expensive wars against England in Gascony, against the Flemish, whose towns handed him a humiliating defeat at Courtrai in 1302. Medieval kings had no reliable system of general taxation. Revenue came from crown lands, feudal dues, and whatever extraordinary levies could be negotiated. Philip's expenses far outran those sources for his entire reign, and the record of his financial expedients is a catalogue of increasingly aggressive measures. He debased the currency repeatedly, reducing the silver content of the coinage, which is effectively a tax on everyone holding money and which caused riots. He levied taxes on the clergy, which brought him into direct and prolonged confrontation with Pope Boniface VIII. A conflict that escalated until Philip's agents seized the elderly pope at Anagni in 1303 in an episode that shocked Europe and from which Boniface died shortly afterward. He then engineered the election of a French pope and the removal of the papal court to Avignon, where it remained for most of the century under French influence. The papacy at Avignon is sometimes called the Babylonian captivity of the Church, and the phrase conveys how contemporaries outside France felt about it. 7 successive popes, all French, resided there for nearly 70 years, and the perception that the head of the universal church had become an instrument of one kingdom did lasting damage to papal authority. Damage that fed, in the following century, into the Great Schism and eventually into the pressures that produced the Reformation. Philip's victory over the papacy was complete, and its consequences ran for 200 years. In 1306, he arrested every Jew in France in a single coordinated operation, expelled them from the kingdom, and confiscated their property and the debts owed to them. In 1311, he did something similar to Italian bankers, the Lombards. The pattern is unmistakable. Identify a wealthy group with limited political protection, arrest them all at once, seize their assets, and cancel the crown's debts to them in the process. The Templars were wealthy. They were unpopular. They had no secular ruler to protect them, because their protector was the Pope, and Philip now largely controlled the Pope. They held a fortified treasury in the middle of his capital, and the crown owed them money. The 1306 expulsion of the Jews is not an aside. It is the rehearsal. Philip's officials had, 1 year before the Templar arrests, successfully executed a nationwide simultaneous mass arrest with asset seizure. They knew it could be done. They knew how to do it. And there is a further precedent that is less often mentioned. In 1291, Philip had expelled a group of Italian merchants and seized their assets. He did it again to the Lombards in 1311 after the Templars. The sequence: Italians, Jews, Templars, Lombards is not 4 separate crises. It is a policy applied repeatedly to whichever wealthy and politically unprotected group was available at the moment the treasury needed refilling. Destroying the Templars required more than force because they were a papal order and the king had no jurisdiction over them. What Philip needed was a charge that transcended jurisdiction, and in the legal thinking of the period there was exactly one: heresy. Heresy was different from other crimes. It was an offence against God and the faith. It fell under inquisitorial procedure rather than ordinary law, and, crucially, a secular ruler could claim the duty of acting against it if the church failed to. Inquisitorial procedure also had a feature that made it ideal for this purpose. It permitted torture. It did not require an accuser, and confession was regarded as the highest form of proof. The material came from informants. The central figure was a man named Esquin de Floyran, a former Templar or associate. The sources differ. Who had been expelled or had fallen out with the order, and who had begun circulating accusations. He appears to have offered them first to the King of Aragon, who investigated and dismissed them. He then brought them to France, where they found a receptive audience. Through 1306 and into 1307, royal agents gathered statements, planted informers, and assembled a dossier. The charges that emerged were carefully constructed. They were not accusations of financial impropriety or of failing in the Holy Land, which would have been arguable and unspectacular. They were accusations of a secret, systematic, institutional apostasy, that at their initiation ceremonies, held at night behind closed doors, new Templars were required to deny Christ, to spit or trample on the crucifix, to exchange kisses on the mouth and other parts of the body, and to submit to sodomy, that they worshipped an idol in the form of a bearded head, that their priests omitted the words of consecration from the Mass. These charges have 3 features worth noticing. First, they exploited the order's own secrecy. Templar chapter meetings genuinely were closed, and their reception ceremonies genuinely were private. And the rule genuinely did forbid brothers from revealing what happened at chapter. The reason was administrative rather than sinister. Chapter meetings were where discipline was handled, where a brother confessed his faults, where penalties were assigned, where internal disputes were settled. An organisation that punishes its members in private and requires them not to discuss it outside is protecting its own authority and the dignity of the men involved. The same logic that keeps modern disciplinary proceedings confidential. But 2 centuries of enforced silence about what happens in a closed room is, in the hands of a hostile prosecutor, indistinguishable from concealment. That secrecy had a mundane explanation, but it meant that nobody outside could say what did not happen inside. Second, they were, in their essentials, standard. Accusations of denial of Christ, obscene kisses, idol worship, and sexual deviance were the boilerplate of medieval heresy prosecutions, applied to Cathars, to Jews, to lepers, and later to alleged witches. The Templar indictment was not an original document, it was a template filled in. The same accusations: denial of the faith, obscene kisses, idol worship, ritual sexual license, secret nocturnal meetings, had been made against the Cathars in the previous century, against the Waldensians, against various groups of Jews, and would be made against alleged witches for the next 400 years. Historians who study heresy prosecutions can predict the contents of an indictment before reading it, because the contents were not derived from investigation. They were derived from a shared cultural image of what secret evil looks like, and that image barely changed in 5 centuries. Third, they were unfalsifiable in the only way that mattered. A man who denied them was concealing the truth. A man who admitted them had confessed. The procedure had no exit. It is worth adding what the charges did not include, because the omission is telling. Nobody accused the Templars of financial fraud, of embezzling the money entrusted to them, of cheating clients, or of failing to deliver on their banking obligations. If the order had been corrupt in the ordinary way, that is where the evidence would have been, and the Crown had full access to their books from the first morning. The charges went straight to secret spiritual crimes precisely because the mundane ones were not available. The trap is set and the letters are written, but it is not October yet. Before the arrests, the story pauses in a Templar house in the French countryside on an ordinary evening in the summer of 1307, when nothing has happened yet. It is late in the day at the end of harvest, and the light is coming long and gold across the fields. The preceptory is a modest cluster of buildings around a courtyard. A hall, a chapel with a small round tower, stables, granaries, a dovecote, a barn with the doors standing open and the smell of new grain coming out of it. There is a low wall around the whole thing that would not stop anybody, because it was never meant to. This is a farm, not a fortress. 4 brothers live here, and none of them has ever been east. 2 are sergeants who came from local families. 1 is a knight in his 60s who joined 30 years ago after his wife died, and who runs the estate accounts. 1 is a chaplain. Their work today has been the work of every farm in France in August, getting the crop in, checking the tally, arguing mildly with a tenant about a boundary. The bell goes for vespers, and they walk across the courtyard to the chapel, and the office is said in the ordinary way, with the ordinary lack of ceremony of men who have done it every day for decades. The chapel is small and cool, and smells of stone and candle smoke. Through the narrow window the light is going from gold to rose. Then supper, in silence, with a reading. Bread, cheese, some of the summer vegetables, watered wine. The dogs under the table. Afterwards a little conversation is permitted, and the talk is about the harvest, and about a horse that has gone lame, and about whether the responsion this year will be as heavy as the last, and about a rumour from Paris that the king is unhappy about something, which is not news, because the king is always unhappy about something. They check the horses. They go to bed early, because matins is at 4. There is a great quiet in that evening, and a great rest. 200 years of history are folded into these 4 men, and none of it is visible. Bernard's argument, the papal charter, the roads outside Jerusalem, the banner at Hatton, the last men in the compound at Acre. All of it has come down to a farm in France on an August evening, with the swallows working over the stubble and the light going off the chapel wall. In 2 months there will be soldiers in this courtyard. Tonight there is nothing but the smell of grain and the sound of horses moving in the dark. Rest here a while in the last summer of the order before the letters are opened. The swallows are still working over the stubble, low and fast, and the light on the chapel wall has gone from gold to a soft rose and is climbing slowly up toward the roofline. A cart goes past on the road beyond the wall, and the driver calls something to the men in the yard, and one of them calls back, and then it is quiet again, except for the doves and the sound of a bucket being set down somewhere out of sight. The letters went out in September, sealed, to every royal bailiff and seneschal in France, with instructions not to open them until the appointed dawn. When they were opened, they contained an extraordinary preamble, a description of the Templars as a bitter thing, a lamentable thing, a thing horrible to contemplate, and then the operational orders. At dawn on Friday the 13th of October 1307, the arrests happened. The scale of the operation deserves emphasis because it is genuinely remarkable as an administrative feat. Hundreds of separate locations across a large kingdom hit simultaneously with no communications technology and no standing police. It worked because Philip's officials had done it before and because nobody expected it. There was no significant resistance anywhere. The Templars in France did not fight. Most of them were elderly farm managers, and the men who arrived had royal authority and no explanation. That absence of resistance is itself a piece of evidence about what the order had become. There were fortified Templar houses in France, including the Paris Temple with its great tower, and there were men with military training. None of it was used. Nobody barricaded a gate or rode for help. Either they believed the whole thing was a misunderstanding that would be resolved, or they had no conception of themselves as an organisation that could resist a king. And both readings describe an institution very far from the conspiratorial power of the indictment. Jacques de Molay was taken in Paris, at the Temple, where he had been living. He was around 70 years old. The day before, he had walked in the funeral procession of the king's sister-in-law as an honoured guest. That detail is not decoration. It is the strongest single indicator of how completely the arrests came as a surprise. A man who suspected what was coming does not spend his last free day in a public ceremony at the heart of the royal court, in the company of the king who has already sealed the orders. Either Molay had no idea, or he had heard rumours and dismissed them. And there is some evidence for the latter, since accusations had been circulating for a year, and he had asked the Pope to investigate them precisely in order to clear the order's name. The interrogations began almost immediately, and this is the point at which the modern reader needs to understand what medieval interrogation actually was, because the entire evidentiary basis of the case rests on it. Torture was a legal instrument. It was not a secret abuse. It was a documented procedure with rules, conducted by officials in the presence of notaries who recorded the results. Under inquisitorial procedure, confession was the queen of proofs, and torture was the means of obtaining it when the accused was unwilling. The rules held that torture should not be repeated, a limitation routinely circumvented by describing subsequent sessions as continuations of the first, and that a confession under torture had to be freely repeated afterward to be valid, which in practice meant repeated under the certainty that refusal would return the accused to the room. The methods used on the Templars in France are recorded, and I am not going to describe them in detail. It is enough to say that they were the standard instruments of the period, that they were applied over days and weeks, and that they were sufficient to kill a number of men outright. Somewhere in the region of 36 died during the Paris interrogations alone. Under these conditions, the great majority confessed. Of the roughly 138 Templars interrogated in Paris in the weeks after the arrests, all but a handful admitted to some version of the charges. Jacques de Molay confessed on the 24th of October, 11 days after his arrest, and was made to repeat it publicly. The order's own leadership had, apparently, admitted that the accusations were true. That was the intended outcome, and it was achieved with astonishing speed. It is worth pausing on what the confessions actually looked like, because they were not uniform. Men admitted to some charges and denied others. Many said they had denied Christ with the mouth, but not with the heart. A formula that recurs often enough to suggest it was being offered to them. Almost nobody confessed to the sexual charges. Those were denied consistently, even by men who admitted everything else, which is a striking pattern in a body of testimony supposedly extracted to order. The confessions have the texture of men finding the minimum admission that would end the immediate situation, not of a cult revealing its practices. Clement V had a terrible hand and played it badly, and the judgment of history on him has been correspondingly harsh. Though it is worth understanding what he was actually facing before condemning him. He was a Frenchman, elected in 1305 after a long deadlock, at a moment when the papacy had just been catastrophically humiliated by Philip. His predecessor, but one, Boniface, had been seized by French agents and had died shortly after. Clement never went to Rome. He settled eventually at Avignon, in territory under strong French influence, and he spent his pontificate managing a king who had already demonstrated that he would use violence against a pope. The Templar arrests were an outright violation of papal authority. The order answered to the pope. The King of France had no jurisdiction over its members whatsoever. Clement's first reaction was anger, and he said so. He wrote to Philip complaining that the king had acted against all law and had seized persons and property belonging to the Roman Church. Then he began to give ground, and the pattern of the next 7 years was set. Protest, partial resistance, concession. His first substantial move was actually shrewd. In November 1307 he issued a bull, Pastoralis Praemanentiae, ordering all Christian monarchs to arrest the Templars in their territories and hold their property in trust for the Church. This looks like capitulation and was partly that. But it also removed the initiative from Philip and asserted that the Templars were a church matter. Elsewhere in Europe, the results were revealing. In England, Edward II initially refused to believe the charges and only acted under repeated pressure. In Aragon and Portugal, investigations produced little. In Cyprus and Germany, inquiries largely exonerated the order. Almost everywhere outside France, where torture was not applied or was applied lightly, the Templars did not confess. That geographical pattern is one of the strongest arguments in the whole affair. If the order had genuinely maintained a secret heretical practice across 2 centuries and a dozen countries, one would expect the evidence to appear wherever it was looked for. Instead, confessions cluster precisely where torture was used and evaporate where it was not. The English case is instructive in detail. Edward II, who was Philip's son-in-law, initially wrote to other monarchs saying he did not believe the charges. When papal pressure forced him to arrest the English Templars, the investigation produced nothing usable. English law did not permit torture, and the Templars simply denied everything. Only after the Pope specifically authorized the use of torture in England, and inquisitors were brought from the continent, did any confessions appear, and even then they were few and thin. The order in England was dissolved, with most of its members never having admitted anything. In 1308, Clement attempted to take control of the process. He suspended the inquisitors' powers, then negotiated a compromise under which the order would be investigated by papal commissions while individual members were tried by local church courts. He also insisted on examining the leadership himself, and in August 1308, at the castle of Chinon, 3 cardinals sent by the Pope interrogated Jacques de Molay and the other senior officers of the order away from royal officials. What happened at Chinon was known to have occurred, but its outcome was not properly understood for 700 years because the record went into the papal archives and was subsequently misfiled. In 2001, a researcher working in the Vatican secret archives named Barbara Frail identified a document that had been catalogued incorrectly and consequently overlooked. It was the record of the Chinon hearings of August 1308. Its contents are significant. At Chinon, the Templar leaders repeated confessions, but the record shows the cardinals then absolved them. Having heard their admissions and their expressions of repentance, the papal representatives granted them absolution and formally restored them to the sacraments and to the unity of the Church. Understand what that means in the legal and theological framework of the time. Absolution is not acquittal. It does not say the confessed acts did not occur, but it does say that the men in question are not, at the conclusion of the process, heretics. A heretic is one who persists in error. A person who confesses, repents, and receives absolution is reconciled, restored to the Church. The Pope's own representatives, examining the leadership of the order directly, concluded the process by reconciling them rather than condemning them. Clement, in other words, privately determined that the Templar leaders were not heretics in 1308, 6 years before Jacques de Molay was burned as a relapsed heretic. The discovery does not exonerate everyone or resolve every question. Frail's interpretation of some surrounding material has been debated by other historians, and the document does not tell us what Clement thought about the order as a whole. But the core fact is not in dispute. The absolution happened, it is recorded, and it was not made public. Why not? Because Clement was not in a position to make it public. Announcing in 1308 that the Templar leadership had been reconciled would have meant a direct confrontation with Philip, who had already shown what he was capable of, who held the prisoners physically, and who was simultaneously threatening to reopen a posthumous heresy trial against Pope Boniface. A proceeding that would have been a catastrophe for the papacy's authority. Clement was negotiating for the survival of his office. So he did what weak men in impossible positions do. He tried to find a middle path, and the middle path cost other people their lives. The kindest reading of Clement, and it is not an unreasonable one, is that he was playing for the institution rather than for the men. The papacy in 1308 was in genuine danger. A pope had been physically seized 5 years earlier and had died of it. The court had been effectively relocated under French influence, and Philip was openly threatening a posthumous heresy trial of Boniface that would have established the principle that a king could try a pope. Clement traded the Templars for the survival of papal authority. It was a real trade, and it may even have been the right one by the arithmetic of institutional survival. And it was still a betrayal of several thousand men who had been told for 2 centuries that the Pope was their protector. By 1310, the situation had shifted because the Papal Commission investigating the order in Paris was taking testimony under different conditions, not under torture, and with the possibility of a defence. And the Templars mounted one. Nearly 600 brothers came forward to defend the order. They organised. They elected spokesmen. 2 brothers named Pierre de Bologna and Renaud de Provins, both of whom had legal training and who produced arguments that would not disgrace a modern courtroom. They pointed out that the confessions had been obtained by torture and by threats. They pointed out that men had died under interrogation. They demanded that the accusers be named and that the proceedings be conducted properly. Pierre de Bologna's written submission survives and is a remarkable document, clear, forceful, and legally sophisticated, arguing that testimony extracted under coercion has no evidentiary value. He made a further argument that is startlingly modern, that the brothers who had confessed had done so after being held in appalling conditions, threatened, deprived, and shown the instruments, and that the law's own requirement of a free confession was therefore not satisfied even where no torture had formally been applied. He also asked, repeatedly and pointedly, why an order that had allegedly practiced systematic apostasy for 2 centuries had never once been denounced by anyone until a disgruntled former member found a king who needed money. Individual brothers retracted their confessions in large numbers. Men stood up and said that what they had admitted was false, that they had said it to stop the pain or on the promise of release, and that the order was innocent. The defence was gathering momentum through the spring of 1310, and there was a real possibility that the Papal Commission would find the charges unproven. Philip's response was to change the venue. The Archbishop of Sens, a royal appointee, convened a provincial council with jurisdiction over individual Templars in his diocese, separate from the Papal Commission investigating the order. Under canon law, a heretic who confessed and then retracted was a relapsed heretic, and the penalty for relapse was death by burning. The council applied that logic to the men who had withdrawn their confessions. On the 12th of May 1310, 54 Templars were taken to a field outside Paris and burned. The effect on the defence was immediate and total. Men who had been prepared to retract understood precisely what retraction now meant. The organised defence collapsed within days. Pierre de Bologna disappeared from the record entirely. He was removed from custody and never seen again, and what happened to him is unknown. More burnings followed in other dioceses through 1310 and 1311. The total number burned across France in this period is uncertain, and the estimates vary. The figure of 54 for the May execution outside Paris is reasonably firm, and further groups died in Senlis and elsewhere in the following weeks and months. Contemporary accounts of the May burnings note that the men went to their deaths declaring their innocence, and that this troubled the crowd. Enough that it is recorded in an environment where recording it was not helpful to anyone. The proceedings before the Papal Commission continued, but the Templars had been shown that telling the truth was a capital offence, and the testimony that followed was accordingly compliant. It is worth being precise about the moral shape of this, because it is the crux of the entire affair. The men burned in May 1310 were burned for saying that they were innocent. The legal mechanism that killed them was triggered by the retraction, not by the alleged heresy. Anyone who maintained a false confession lived. Anyone who told the truth died. The Council of Vienne opened in October 1311, and it was supposed to settle the matter. Bishops and prelates from across Christendom assembled to determine the fate of the order. It did not go as Philip wished. When the assembled churchmen were asked whether the order should be allowed to defend itself, the majority said yes. The evidence, in the view of most of the council, did not establish the charges. There was considerable resistance to the idea of abolishing a papal order on the basis of confessions extracted in one kingdom under conditions everyone understood. Philip came to Vienne in person with an army in March 1312. The pressure was not subtle. Clement's solution was a piece of legal engineering that has been argued about ever since. On the 22nd of March 1312, he issued the bull Vox in excelso, and its wording is careful to the point of contortion. It states that the charges against the order had not been proven. It states that, nevertheless, the order had been so thoroughly defamed that it could not continue to function, and that its continued existence would be an obstacle to any future crusade. And on that basis, not by judicial condemnation, but by what the bull calls provision or apostolic ordinance, an administrative act of papal authority. The Order of the Temple was abolished. The distinction is not a technicality, and it matters enormously. The Templars were never found guilty. The Church did not condemn them as heretics as an institution. It dissolved them administratively on grounds of reputation, while explicitly declining to affirm the charges. That is either a cowardly evasion or the maximum resistance available to a man in Clement's position, and reasonable people have taken both views for 7 centuries. It is worth noting what the wording made possible afterward. Because the order was never condemned, its members were never legally heretics as a class, which is why so many of them were quietly pensioned, absorbed into other orders, or simply released. A judicial condemnation would have made every surviving Templar in Europe a convicted heretic with all the consequences that carried. Clement's formula, whatever its motives, protected several thousand men from that, while doing nothing whatsoever for the ones already in French custody. A second bull, ad providam, disposed of the property. The Templar estates were transferred to the Hospitallers, not to the Crown of France, which was Philip's preference. In practice, the transfer was messy and incomplete. Philip extracted enormous sums from the Hospitallers in expenses and administration costs before releasing anything, and in some kingdoms the property never reached them at all. But the principle held, and the bulk of the Templar patrimony ended up with the rival order rather than with the king who had destroyed them. Individual Templars were dealt with case by case. Those who had confessed and been reconciled were pensioned off, usually into other religious houses, and a number were still drawing those pensions decades later. Those who maintained innocence faced the relapse problem. Those in kingdoms where the investigation had found nothing were mostly quietly released. For the great majority of the several thousand Templars in Europe, the end of the order meant not martyrdom, but redundancy. A middle-aged man who had spent his life running a farm for an institution that no longer existed moved to another monastery on a pension with a stipend and nothing to do. Records of those pensions survive in places, and some of the recipients lived a long time. There were former Templars still drawing an allowance in the 1330s and beyond, old men in monastic houses, the last surviving members of an organisation that had been formally abolished decades earlier. Somewhere in the middle of the 14th century, the last of them died, and nobody recorded who it was. 4 men remained unresolved. The senior leadership still in custody 6 years after the arrests. In March 1314, a commission of cardinals convened in front of Notre Dame in Paris to pronounce sentence. The 4 were brought out on a platform before a crowd. The confessions were read. The sentence was perpetual imprisonment. And then Jacques de Molay, 70 years old, 6.5 years in a cell, spoke. He denied everything. He said that the confessions were false, that they had been extracted by torture, that the order was pure and innocent and holy, and that he had lied about it to save himself and would not do so any longer. It is worth asking why he did it then, after 6.5 years of compliance. Nothing in the sentence was a surprise. Perpetual imprisonment was the expected outcome, and he had, by all appearances, accepted it. The most likely answer is that this was the last public moment he would ever have. He was 70. He was being displayed on a platform in front of Notre Dame while his confession was read aloud to the people of Paris, and after that day he would disappear into a cell and die there with the record standing. If the truth was going to be said at all, it had to be said in the next few minutes, in front of witnesses. He said it. Geoffroy de Charny, the preceptor of Normandy, stood with him and said the same. The other 2 remained silent and lived out their sentences. Their names were Hugues de Pyrard, the Visitor of France, and Geoffroy de Gonneville, Preceptor of Aquitaine. They are largely forgotten, which is itself part of the story. The two who stayed silent got life imprisonment and obscurity, and the two who spoke got the fire and 700 years of remembrance. That is not a moral lesson so much as an observation about how history selects. The cardinals were unprepared and adjourned to consider. Philip did not adjourn. He was informed that afternoon, and he acted the same day, without consulting the church, on the direct application of the relapse rule. Two men who had confessed had publicly retracted, and the penalty for relapse was fire. That evening, on a small island in the Seine near the royal gardens, Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charny were burned. The island was the Île aux Juifs, a small strip of land that has since been absorbed into the larger island at the western tip of the Île de la Cité. It is under the Pont Neuf now, in the little park at the point, a few minutes' walk from Notre Dame. There is a small plaque. Tourists walk over the site continuously without noticing, which is probably the correct fate for it. The accounts of it are brief and consistent on one point. They died well. Molay asked to be positioned facing the Cathedral of Notre Dame and to have his hands free so that he could join them in prayer. Contemporary chroniclers, including some hostile to the order, record that both men maintained their innocence to the end and endured what followed without crying out, and that this made a considerable impression on the crowd. Enough that people were reported to have gathered the ashes afterward as relics. And then there is the curse. The story goes that from the fire Molay called out, summoning Pope Clement and King Philip to appear before the judgment of God within a year, and cursing the royal line to the 13th generation. Clement V died on the 20th of April 1314, about a month later. Philip IV died on the 29th of November 1314, at 46, after a stroke or a hunting accident, depending on the account. Within 14 years, all three of Philip's sons had died, without a surviving male heir, ending the direct Capetian line and precipitating the succession dispute that became the 100 Years' War. That is the legend, and the deaths are real. The curse itself, however, is almost certainly not. The earliest accounts of the execution do not mention it. It appears in sources written decades later, by which time the coincidence of the deaths was well known and a satisfying explanation was available. What we are looking at is a story constructed backwards from an outcome, which is, as it happens, exactly how most curses in history work. But the coincidence is remarkable, and it is easy to see why 14th century Europe found it irresistible. Two men destroy an order of warrior monks on charges the church itself declined to confirm. Both are dead within 8 months, and the dynasty that did it fails entirely within a generation. The dynastic collapse itself has a mundane explanation that nobody wanted at the time. Philip had 3 sons, all of whom reigned in turn, and all of whom failed to produce a surviving male heir. A run of bad luck rather than a supernatural intervention, though the family's affairs in those years, including a scandal involving the wives of all 3 princes that broke in 1314, gave contemporaries plenty of material to work with. The result was the end of the direct Capetian line after more than 3 centuries, a disputed succession, and the English claim to the French throne that produced the 100 Years' War. The fires are out. Before we deal with the treasure and the legends and everything that was built on top of this story afterward, the night pauses one last time on the river, some hours after it ended. It is very late in Paris, and the crowd has long gone home. The island in the Seine is a low strip of ground with willows on it, hardly more than a sandbank, and there is nothing on it now but the dark and the smell of wet ash and the river going past on both sides. The water is black and moving, catching a little light where the current turns. Paris in 1314 has no street lights. What there is comes from windows, and at this hour there are very few. The great bulk of Notre Dame stands upstream, unfinished still in places, its towers darker than the sky behind them. A dog barks somewhere in the city and stops. A boat is moored somewhere below with the water knocking against it, that hollow small sound that carries a long way over water at night. The willows move a little. It is early spring and cold, and there is mist coming off the river in patches, lying low over the surface and drifting. 200 years ago, 9 men in Jerusalem took vows to guard a road. Everything that followed came out of that. The charter, the donations, the castles, the banner at Hattin, the ledgers and the letters of credit, the compound at Acre with the sea behind it, the farms in France with the swallows over the stubble. And it ends here, on a sandbank in a river, on a cold night in March, with the ash going into the water. There is a great quiet in that, and a great rest. Nothing more can happen to them now, whatever they were. And we will spend the rest of tonight trying to say honestly what they were. The argument is over for the men themselves, and the river is carrying it away in the dark, and Paris is asleep on both banks, and the stars are turning over the whole of it as though nothing at all had occurred. Rest here a while, on the water, before the legends begin. The mist thickens and thins over the surface. Somewhere upstream a night bird goes over the water calling. On both banks the city is dark and enormous and asleep, tens of thousands of people breathing in the dark behind shuttered windows, and none of them will remember tomorrow that anything in particular happened tonight. The current keeps moving. The willows hang over it. The ash goes on downstream, past the walls, past the mills, out toward the country and the sea. Now the question everybody asks, what happened to the treasure? The disappointing and almost certainly correct answer is that there was no treasure to lose, in the sense that the legend requires. Philip's officials seized the Paris temple on the morning of the arrests and inventoried its contents. They found the physical treasury of the order in France, and what was in it was substantially less than the crown had hoped. The reason is the one we saw earlier. The Templars were land-rich and cash-poor by design. Their wealth was in property. Thousands of estates producing annual income, not in vaults of coin. And a great deal of their liquid capital was permanently in transit or committed, funding the Eastern establishment or held on deposit for clients whose money it actually was. There is also a simpler point that legend hunters skip. The order had been in decline for 16 years since the fall of Acre, still paying for a headquarters on Cyprus and a fleet and garrisons, with no conquests and no plunder coming in. Organisations in that condition do not accumulate, they draw down. What the crown got was substantial nonetheless. The movable property, the revenues during the years of custody, the cancellation of royal debts to the order, and enormous administrative expenses extracted from the hospitallers before the estates were handed over. Philip did well out of it. He did not, however, find a mountain of gold, and the surviving financial records of the French crown in the following years show a treasury still under strain. If he had discovered the fabled hoard, his accounts would look different. There is also a documentary point that settles the matter as far as it can be settled. The inventories taken at the seizure survive in part, and they are the mundane records of an agricultural and administrative organisation. Livestock, grain stores, tools, furnishings, vestments, plate, and account books. Nobody itemizing the contents of the Paris temple in October 1307 wrote down anything that reads like a legendary treasure, and they had every incentive to record what they found because they were accounting to a king. The estates themselves went, as we saw, mostly to the Hospitallers, who were thereby made enormously wealthy and who used the endowment to sustain themselves for centuries. First on Rhodes, then on Malta, where their successors survive as a sovereign entity to this day. The most direct beneficiary of the destruction of the Templars was their rival order, which absorbed their property and outlived them by 700 years and counting. There is no evidence the Hospitallers engineered any of it, and some evidence they were uncomfortable with the whole affair. But they took the estates, and the transfer was the making of them. It is one of the more ordinary ironies in the story. The organisation that gained most from the destruction of the Templars was the one that had spent 2 centuries competing with them for exactly those donations. The second great legend is the fleet. The story, in its popular form, holds that on the night before the arrests, 18 Templar galleys slipped out of the Atlantic port of La Rochelle, loaded with the Order's treasure and its most sacred secrets, and vanished. To Scotland, to Portugal, to the New World, depending on the version. Here is what can actually be said. The Templars did have ships. They needed them. An organisation moving men, horses, money, and supplies between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean requires shipping, and they maintained a fleet for that purpose, mostly in the Mediterranean, with some Atlantic capacity. La Rochelle was a Templar port, and a significant one. The specific claim about 18 ships sailing on the night of the 12th of October comes from a single line in the testimony of one Templar, given under interrogation, referring to a brother who had fled with the Order's treasure. And it is thin, uncorroborated, and given under exactly the conditions that make Templar testimony unreliable in every other respect. People who reject every confession as torture-induced and then accept this one detail of being inconsistent. What is true is that the arrests in France were not perfectly comprehensive. Some Templars were away, some were warned, some simply were not found. Estimates suggest a meaningful number evaded arrest, and a few are recorded as having been captured later, or as having lived quietly under other identities. Ships in Templar ports would have been dispersed by their crews once the news broke, as any valuable asset would be. Some brothers certainly fled to kingdoms where they would not be prosecuted, but a coordinated evacuation of a treasure fleet requires foreknowledge, and there is no evidence the Order had it. On the contrary, everything about the French Templars' behaviour in October 1307 indicates total surprise. No resistance anywhere. The Grand Master walking in a royal funeral procession the day before. The Paris treasury still in the Paris temple when the officials arrived. There is one further consideration that the legend requires, and that reality does not supply: a destination. A fleet carrying an Order's entire wealth has to go somewhere, unload and be maintained. Ships need ports, crews need paying, and cargo needs storing. None of that can be done invisibly in 14th century Europe, where every harbour was watched, every large transaction was noticed, and every kingdom had an interest in Templar property. The absence of any trace. No unexplained wealth surfacing anywhere, no ships in any port record, no rumours in any contemporary chronicle, is exactly what you would expect if it did not happen. The Scotland version deserves a specific note because it is the most persistent. It holds that the fleet sailed to Scotland, where Robert the Bruce, excommunicated and therefore beyond papal jurisdiction, sheltered the Templars, who then fought at Bannockburn in 1314 and won the battle for him. There is no contemporary evidence for any of this. It appears in no medieval source. It emerges in the 18th and 19th centuries, and it emerges from the same milieu that produced the Masonic Templar revival, which we will come to. Bannockburn was won by Scottish schiltrons and Scottish cavalry, and the Scots who fought it would be puzzled to learn that the credit was later handed to French monks. The most interesting thing about the end of the Templars is that in much of Europe, it was not an end at all. In Portugal, King Diniz had no interest in destroying an order that had been instrumental in the Reconquista, and that held frontier fortresses he needed defended. He negotiated with the papacy, and in 1319 a new order was established, the Order of Christ, which received the Portuguese Templars, the Templar properties, and effectively the same institution under a different name. The negotiation that produced it is a small masterpiece of diplomacy. Diniz argued that the Templar property in Portugal had been granted by Portuguese kings for the defence of Portuguese frontiers against Muslim powers, that this defence was still necessary, and that transferring the estates to the Hospitallers or to anyone else would weaken the kingdom's security to no purpose. The papacy, which had no interest in undermining a frontier state and which had never actually condemned the order, agreed. The same argument was made with variations in Aragon and Valencia, and it worked there too. Where a king had a use for them, the Templars survived under another name. Where a king wanted their property, they did not. Its headquarters remained at Tamar, the old Templar castle, which still stands and is one of the great monuments of the country. The convent of Christ at Tamar makes the continuity physical. At its core is the Corolla, the round church built by the Templars in the 12th century on the model of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. The octagonal form Templar church is used across Europe, including the Temple Church in London. Around that Romanesque core, later centuries added Gothic and then Manueline work, the ornate Portuguese style of the Age of Exploration, carved with ropes, corals, seaweed, and the instruments of navigation. It is a single building in which the crusading past and the maritime future are physically attached to one another. Tourists walk through it in an afternoon. The Templar round church and the window carved with the ropes and knots of the ocean voyages are perhaps 40 metres apart, and about 300 years, and one continuous institutional history that officially does not exist. And then that order did something remarkable. In the 15th century, its Grand Master was Prince Henry, called the Navigator, and the resources of the Order of Christ helped fund the Portuguese voyages of exploration down the African coast and eventually across the world. The cross of the Order of Christ, a red cross of a distinctive shape directly descended from the Templar cross, was painted on the sails of those ships. It is on the sails in the paintings of Vasco da Gama's fleet. It went around Africa to India and across the Atlantic to Brazil. There is an irony in that worth noticing. The order was destroyed on the grounds that it had lost its purpose and no longer served the defence of Christendom. Its Portuguese successor then funded the voyages that opened the Atlantic world, which is to say, the institution found a new mission almost immediately once a king had a reason to let it. What killed the Templars in France was not the absence of a possible future. It was the absence of a king who wanted them to have one. So the most concrete afterlife of the Templars is not a secret society or a hidden treasure. It is a cross on a sail, sailing into the Atlantic 80 years after the order was dissolved, funding the first phase of European overseas expansion. In Aragon and Castile, similarly, the Templars were absorbed into existing or new Iberian military orders. Montesa in Valencia, and elsewhere into the Hospitallers and the orders of Calatrava and Santiago. In Germany, where the investigation had found nothing, most brothers transferred into the Teutonic Knights or the Hospitallers. In England, the order was dissolved and the brothers were dispersed into monasteries with pensions. For the individual Templar in most of Europe, therefore, the destruction of the order meant a change of employer. It was a catastrophe for the French leadership, and for the 54 men burned outside Paris, and for the men who died under interrogation. It was, for the majority of the several thousand brothers across Christendom, a bureaucratic reassignment. That is a deeply unromantic conclusion, and it is what the records show. Now to the legends. Because the Templars have generated more mythology than almost any organisation in history, and the striking thing about nearly all of it is how recent it is. Here is the crucial fact to hold on to. Between 1314 and roughly 1730, the Templars were of very little interest to anybody. They appear in histories as a dissolved medieval order about which there had been a scandal. They are not associated with the Grail, or with secret knowledge, or with hidden treasure, or with any surviving underground organisation. For 400 years they are a closed historical episode. The one place they persisted in ordinary memory was in place, names and buildings. London kept its Temple district and its round church. Paris kept the Temple Quarter, whose great tower was eventually used as a prison. It held Louis XVI and his family before their executions, which is a coincidence that later legend would put to enthusiastic use. Before Napoleon had it demolished precisely to stop it becoming a shrine. Across Europe, villages named Temple and Templecombe and Templemore marked where preceptories had stood. The order left a residue in the landscape long after it had left the imagination. Then, in the 18th century, they were rediscovered and reinvented. The engine was Freemasonry. Masonic lodges, developing rapidly across Europe in the early 1700s, had a structural appetite for origin stories. A fraternal organisation with rituals and degrees benefits enormously from a claim of ancient descent. In 1736, in a speech delivered in Paris, a Scottish Freemason named Andrew Michael Ramsay proposed that Freemasonry descended from the crusading orders. He did not specifically say Templars, but the door was open, and within a few decades a range of Masonic systems had walked through it, claiming direct transmission from the Order of the Temple through a secret lineage of Grand Masters. There is no evidence for any of this. None. There is no documentary chain, no institutional continuity, no surviving records, and no reason to think that an order dissolved in 1312 secretly persisted in undocumented form for 4 centuries before surfacing in 18th century gentlemen's clubs. The claim was made because it was attractive, and it was accepted because people wanted it. And it is worth understanding why it was attractive in that particular moment. 18th century Freemasonry was expanding among educated, often aristocratic men in a Europe where the church's authority was being questioned, and where secret fraternal association carried a whiff of danger. A lineage running back to a persecuted medieval order, destroyed in the telling by a corrupt king and a compliant pope for knowing too much, flattered exactly the self-image that milieu wanted. The Templars were recruited posthumously into an 18th century argument about authority and enlightenment, and they have been serving in it ever since. But it did something important. It made the Templars interesting again, and it established the template of the Templars as keepers of a secret. Everything afterward is built on that foundation. The French Revolution added fuel. The idea circulated that the execution of Louis XVI in 1793 was the delayed revenge of the Templars on the French monarchy. A story helped by an apocryphal account of a man leaping onto the scaffold and crying that Jacques de Molay was avenged. It is not contemporary, and is almost certainly invented, but it fused the Templars permanently to the idea of a hidden hand operating across centuries. the 19th century supplied the occult layer. Baphomet, the name that appears in the trial records as an idol the Templars supposedly worshipped, and which is most plausibly a garbled French rendering of Mahomet, reflecting the standard medieval slander that suspects were secretly Muslim, was taken up by the French occultist Eliphas Lévy in the 1850s. Lévy drew a goat-headed winged figure, labelled it Baphomet, and that image, invented in the 19th century by a Frenchman writing about magic, is now what most people picture when the word appears. It has no medieval basis whatsoever. The word itself appears only a handful of times in the trial records, in inconsistent forms, from a small number of the hundreds of men interrogated, and the descriptions of the supposed idol contradict each other wildly. A head, a cat, a figure with 3 faces, a painted panel, an object nobody had seen. That inconsistency is what you would expect from men being asked leading questions under duress about an object that did not exist, and it is not what you would expect from a genuine cult with a genuine cult image. The Grail came in the same period and by a similar route. The medieval Grail romances are 12th and 13th century literature. One of them, by the German poet Wolfram von Eschenbach, has the Grail guarded by an order of knights he calls Templars, which is a poetic invention loosely inspired by the real Templars in the way a novelist borrows a flavour. That is the entire textual connection. From it, and from 19th and 20th century esoteric writing, grew the vast modern edifice of Templars and the Grail. The 20th century industrialised all of it. Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, built in the 15th century. 150 years after the order was dissolved, by a family with no documented Templar connection, was retrofitted as a Templar site. The Ark of the Covenant, the Shroud of Turin, the Head of John the Baptist, Oak Island, the Priory of Sion, the last of which was a documented 20th century hoax created by a Frenchman named Pierre Plantard in the 1950s, whose forged genealogies were deposited in a library and later taken seriously by popular authors. All attach themselves to the same story. The mechanism by which this happens is worth naming, because once you see it everywhere. A historical group is destroyed under mysterious circumstances and leaves an unexplained gap. The gap functions as an attachment point. Any unresolved mystery can be connected to it, and each connection makes the group seem more mysterious, which makes it a better attachment point for the next one. The Templars are the most successful attachment point in European history, because their end genuinely was strange, genuinely was unjust, and genuinely did leave questions, which is what makes the accumulated nonsense so difficult to separate from the real and remarkable story underneath. And Friday the 13th. This is worth stating clearly because the claim is repeated constantly. The superstition about Friday the 13th does not come from the Templar arrests. Fear of Fridays and fear of the number 13 are separately attested in European folklore, but their combination into a single unlucky day does not appear in the historical record until the late 19th century, and the connection to the arrests of 1307 was not proposed until the 20th. The arrests did occur on a Friday the 13th. The proximate source appears to be a novel published in 1907 that used the date as a device, and the association was then popularised through the 20th century and cemented by later bestsellers. It is a good example of a general pattern in this material. A claim appears in fiction, is repeated in popular non-fiction, and within 2 generations is being stated as an established historical fact by people who have no idea where it came from. Nobody noticed or cared for about 600 years. Strip all of that away, and what is left? An organisation of a few thousand men, most of them not knights, and most of them never seeing combat, running a vast agricultural and financial network across Europe to fund a permanent military commitment in the Eastern Mediterranean. Sworn to poverty individually while collectively controlling enormous wealth. Genuinely disciplined, genuinely brave, and by the standards of any period genuinely effective as soldiers. Also arrogant, litigious, resented by neighbours, damaging in their rivalry with the Hospitallers, and responsible through their leadership for at least one catastrophic strategic decision that destroyed a kingdom. It is worth resisting the pull toward either extreme, because both are available and both are wrong. The Templars were not a criminal conspiracy, and they were not an order of saints. They were an institution, and institutions behave like institutions. They accumulate. They defend their privileges. They resist reform. They produce individuals of real integrity and individuals of none, and they are capable of both remarkable self-sacrifice and petty self-interest, often in the same week. The men who died at Acre covering the evacuation and the men who litigated for 40 years over a disputed mill in Champagne belonged to the same organisation. Were they guilty of the charges? The evidence says no, and the reasoning is not complicated. The confessions come almost exclusively from jurisdictions that used torture and evaporate where it was not used. The accused retracted the moment the immediate threat lifted and were burned for it. The charges were formulaic, drawn from a standard heresy template applied to numerous groups in the period. 2 centuries of an institution with thousands of members across a dozen countries had produced no prior hint of systematic apostasy, and no independent evidence of it has ever been found. The Pope's own commissioners absolved the leadership privately. The papal bull dissolving the order explicitly declined to affirm the charges. Is there anything at all behind them? Possibly a little, and it is worth being honest about it rather than delivering a clean verdict. Some historians, including Frail, have argued that the reception ceremonies may have included a ritual element, a symbolic denial or gesture toward the cross, intended perhaps as a test of obedience or as preparation for what a captured brother might face under duress from Muslim captors, which was then wildly misunderstood or deliberately distorted by prosecutors. This remains speculative and is not accepted by all historians. There were also, undoubtedly, individual Templars guilty of individual sins. An organisation of thousands always contains them. Neither of these is remotely the same as the institutional Satanism of the indictment. The most probable summary is this: the Templars were destroyed because they were rich, unpopular, no longer useful, protected only by a pope who could not protect himself, and in the path of a king who had already perfected the technique of arresting an entire wealthy minority in a single morning and taking their property. The heresy charges were the instrument, not the reason, and the clearest evidence for that is the timing. The Templars had held their secret chapters and conducted their private receptions for 200 years, under the eyes of a dozen kingdoms, and a papacy that was frequently at odds with them, without anyone raising the alarm. Nothing about their practices changed in 1307. What changed was that a king ran out of money and a pope ran out of independence. There is one more thing worth saying before the conclusions, and it concerns how we know any of this, because the Templar affair is unusual among medieval events in the sheer volume of documentation it left behind. Medieval history is normally reconstructed from fragments, a chronicle written decades later by a monk with an agenda, a charter, a handful of letters, an archaeological layer. For most events of the period, the evidence is thin enough that historians argue about basic facts. The Templar trial is the opposite. Because it was conducted as a formal legal proceeding under inquisitorial procedure, And because that procedure required meticulous notarial record-keeping, the interrogations were written down as they happened. Notaries recorded the questions, the answers, the names of those present, the dates. Depositions from hundreds of individual men survive, in France and in other kingdoms, running to thousands of pages. The Papal Commission's proceedings in Paris survive. The record from Chinon survives and was rediscovered in 2001. The bulls survive. Substantial parts of the property inventories survive. The result is that we can read, 700 years later, what an individual Templar in a village in Normandy said when he was asked whether he had spat on the cross. We can read his name and his age and how long he had been in the order and what job he did. We can read him confessing, and in some cases we can read him retracting, and we can trace what happened to him afterward. Some of the depositions are unexpectedly moving in their ordinariness. Men give their age and are unsure of it. They describe their reception into the order decades earlier and cannot remember details. They mention the brother who received them, long dead. One recurring feature is how many of them had joined as older men, after a career or a marriage. The Templars were not principally an order of young idealists, but a place where a substantial number of middle-aged men went to spend the rest of their lives usefully. Those are the voices in the record. Farm managers in their 50s, being asked about spitting on a crucifix. That is an extraordinary thing to possess, and it produces a particular kind of historical knowledge. It means the case against the Templars can be examined on its own terms rather than argued about in the abstract, and when it is examined, it falls apart in the specific ways described earlier. The geographical correlation with torture, the formulaic charges, the contradictory descriptions of the supposed idol, the immediate retractions. There is a bleak irony in it. The machinery that destroyed the order was so bureaucratically thorough that it preserved the evidence of its own methods. Philip's lawyers wanted an unimpeachable legal record, and they produced one. And the record they produced is the reason no serious historian now believes the charges. There is a lesson in that which extends well beyond the Templars. Regimes that destroy people carefully, with paperwork, tend to convict themselves in the long run. The archive outlives the intention. What was created to establish guilt permanently becomes, once the political pressure that produced it has evaporated, the most damning evidence available about the people who created it. Philip's lawyers were building a case for eternity. They succeeded, and the case they built is against themselves. The paperwork that was meant to prove guilt for eternity has instead documented in the prosecutor's own hand exactly how the confessions were obtained. The Vatican published a facsimile edition of the trial documents in 2007, 700 years after the arrests, in a limited and expensive printing. The Chinon parchment was included. It is the most complete institutional acknowledgement the Church has made of the affair, and it stops well short of anything that could be called an apology. But the documents are out, and they say what they say. There is a reason this story has held people's attention for 700 years, and it is not the treasure. It is that the Templar trial is one of the clearest early demonstrations of a mechanism that has been repeated in different costumes ever since. The mechanism has 4 parts. First, identify a target that is wealthy, unpopular, and structurally unable to defend itself. The Templars were rich, resented, and, critically, had no constituency. They had no homeland, no secular lord, no population that identified with them. Their only protector was a distant institution that had already been shown to be vulnerable. Second, choose a charge that cannot be disproved. Secret crimes committed behind closed doors by an organization that genuinely does keep its proceedings secret. There is no possible evidence of innocence. The absence of evidence is itself explained by the secrecy. Third, obtain confessions by whatever means the law permits, and then treat the confessions as proof. The procedure generates its own evidence. It is a closed loop, and it will produce whatever result is required of it. Fourth, make retraction fatal. Once the penalty for withdrawing a confession is death, the record becomes permanently unreliable, and everyone knows it, and the proceedings continue anyway. Every part of that has recurred. The specific vocabulary changes. Heresy, treason, counter-revolution, whatever the age requires. But the structure is stable, and the reason it is stable is that it is not really a legal procedure at all. It is a method for converting a decision that has already been made into a record that looks like a finding. The decision came first. Philip determined that the Templars would be destroyed, and the apparatus was then set in motion to produce the justification. Everything that followed, the charges, the interrogations, the confessions, the burnings of those who retracted, was the machinery of documentation, not of discovery. That is why the outcome was never in doubt from the morning of the arrests, and the Templar case is one of the best documented early examples precisely because so much of the paperwork survived. Thousands of pages of testimony exist because the process was bureaucratically meticulous, and the meticulousness is what allows historians to demonstrate, 7 centuries later, exactly how the thing was done. There is a second lesson, quieter and perhaps more useful. The Templars were destroyed at the precise moment when their purpose had ended and their privileges had not. For roughly 16 years after the fall of Acre, they continued to hold enormous wealth and unique exemptions on the basis of a mission that no longer existed, and they made no serious attempt to redefine themselves. The Teutonic Knights, facing the same problem, moved to a new frontier and built a state. The Hospitallers moved to Rhodes, became a naval power, and survived into the modern world. Their trajectory is worth a moment because it is the counterfactual. Driven from the Holy Land alongside the Templars, they took Rhodes in the years around 1310 and turned themselves into a sovereign island state with a fleet, fighting a maritime war in the eastern Mediterranean for 2 centuries. When the Ottomans finally took Rhodes in 1522, they moved to Malta, held it against an enormous Ottoman siege in 1565, and remained a European power into the 18th century. They exist today as a sovereign entity, with diplomatic relations with over 100 states, running hospitals and relief operations. Same origin, same crisis, same decade. And one of them is still there. The Templars stayed where they were, kept their privileges, and defended the status quo. And when the attack came, they had no answer to the question of what they were for. Malay's own conduct in his last years illustrates the failure. He spent his final period as Grand Master lobbying against the merger with the Hospitallers and drafting plans for a new crusade that everyone else knew was not coming. He was defending the institution as it had always been, at a moment when the institution's justification had evaporated. There is no evidence he understood the danger. He came to France in 1307 at the Pope's invitation to discuss the crusade and the merger, walked into the kingdom of the man who was about to destroy him, and stayed. In fairness to him, the invitation came from his own superior, and refusing it was not really an option. And the accusations circulating at the time were so obviously absurd to anyone inside the order that treating them as an existential threat would have seemed paranoid. He asked the Pope to investigate precisely because he expected an investigation to clear them. He was, in a sense, destroyed by the reasonable assumption that the truth would matter. Set aside the institution and remember the individuals, because 2 centuries of ordinary lives are buried under this story. There was a young man in Champagne in 1130 who heard Hugues de Payens preach, and decided to give up an inheritance and a marriage to go and guard a road in a country he had never seen. He would have been perhaps 19. He would have had no idea what the heat was like. Nothing in Champagne prepares a person for a Levantine July. The men who went east wore what they had worn at home. Mail over padding, in a climate where the ground temperature can kill. And the adjustment took a generation. The Templars who had been born in Outremer, the ones the chroniclers sometimes call by a name meaning children of the country, understood things about water and heat and timing that every fresh arrival from Europe had to learn or die of. There was a sergeant at Hattin, not a knight, one of the lesser brothers who did the work. Standing in the smoke on that hill on the second morning without water, watching the infantry break away toward the lake and knowing what was going to happen. He was as real as you are. There was a clerk in the Paris temple in 1250, keeping accounts in a hand that survives in some archive somewhere, transferring money for the King of France, checking a column of figures for the third time because it would not balance, and it was getting dark. There was a brother in the compound at Acre in May 1291, in the last 10 days, with the walls being mined beneath him and refugees crowded into the courtyard and no possibility of relief. He knew he was at the end of something 200 years old. There was an old man in a preceptory in Normandy in October 1307, arrested at dawn, who had joined the order at 30 because his family had a connection with it, and who had spent his life managing a mill and 3 farms, and who was told that he had denied Christ at his reception and had spat on the cross, and who said no, that never happened, and who was taken to a room and asked again. And there was somebody in 1310, one of the 54, who had already confessed once, who understood exactly what withdrawing it would mean, and who withdrew it anyway. That last person is the reason this story is worth 3 hours. Not the treasure, not the grail, not the curse. 54 men, most of whose names we do not have, who had already been broken once and who chose, knowing the penalty precisely, to say in public that the confession was a lie. We do not know what they thought they were achieving. They cannot have expected to be believed. The mechanism was closed, and everyone in it understood that. Perhaps it was simply that a man who has spent 40 years in an order sworn to truth cannot go to his death having lied about it. Whatever the reasoning, they made the choice with full information, which is the only kind of courage that counts for anything. And it is worth noticing that they did not do it alone or in a moment. Between the retraction and the fire, there would have been days, the arrest, the transfer, the sentence, the wait. Time enough to reconsider, and a mechanism available for reconsidering. A man who reconfessed could still be reconciled. 54 men had that door open in front of them for as long as it took to arrange a mass execution outside Paris, and none of them walked through it. And now our long night with the Order of the Temple draws to its close, and it is time to set all of it down and let yourself sink towards sleep. There is nothing left to weigh. The story has been told, and none of it needs carrying any further tonight. Let it settle now, softly, the way ash settles on water in the dark. Let it go. The 9 men in Jerusalem and the road with bodies on it. The abbot writing his defence of a new kind of knight. The charter that put them beyond the reach of kings. Let it go. The donations coming in from every corner of Europe. The farms and the mills and the ledgers. The letters of credit passing from London to Acre. The castles going up on the headlands with the sea below them. Let it drift away. The banner on the hill at Hatton. The smoke on the plateau. The last 10 days in the compound at Acre, with the walls coming down. Let it go. The sealed letters, the dawn in October, the rooms with the notaries in them, the 54 in the field outside Paris, the island in the Seine. Let it go. the Pope at Avignon who knew and did not say, the parchment misfiled in an archive for 700 years, the cross that went out on the sails into the Atlantic and meant something new. You do not need to hold any of it. Let it settle and dim and sink into the deep quiet where all the ages go. Feel how far away it all is now and how safe you are here. 700 years of nights have passed over that river since the ash went into the water. Every person in this story has long since lain down, exactly as you are lying down now, and let the day go and close their eyes. The young man from Champagne, the sergeant on the hill at Hatton, the clerk with his column of figures, the old man in Normandy who managed a mill for 30 years. The 54. Jacques de Molay, 70 years old, 6.5 years in a cell. Geoffroy de Charny beside him. Pierre de Bologna, who argued the case and then disappeared out of the record and out of the world. Every one of them slept, at the end of every day, under the same sky that is over you tonight, and every one of them woke up in a world where all of this was still happening, and it is not happening anymore. That is the strange consolation that history offers, and nothing else does. Everything in this story was, at the time, urgent and terrifying and inescapable to the people inside it. The sealed letters were real. The rooms with the notaries were real. And all of it has finished completely. And the people it happened to have been at rest for 700 years, and nothing anyone does now can reach back and touch them. Whatever is urgent tonight will be finished too. Rest now, traveller. Let your body grow heavy and warm. Let the weight of the day and the weight of those 7 centuries settle and release. There is nothing to solve and nothing to finish. What they were and what was done to them can lie unanswered tonight along with everything else. It has waited this long and it will keep until morning. Nobody needs a verdict from you tonight. The historians have been at it for 2 centuries and they will be at it tomorrow, and the men themselves stopped needing anything a very long time ago. Sleep now. The river is dark and moving under Paris, and it has carried away everything that was ever put into it. The roads outside Jerusalem are quiet. The farms in France have other owners, and the men who ran them are 700 years dead. And the cross they wore went out into the Atlantic on other men's sails and is still on a flag or two somewhere, meaning something else entirely. All of it is done. All of it has passed into the same soft dark that is closing over you now. The white mantles are gone, and the horses are gone, and the ledgers have rotted or been burned or lie unread in archives. The castles are ruins in a military zone or tourist sites with ticket offices. The great tower in Paris was pulled down 200 years ago, and there are apartments there now, and people live in them, and cook dinner, and go to bed, over the ground where the treasury stood. Somewhere under a Paris street is the foundation of a tower that held the wealth of a kingdom, and the men who kept the keys have been dust for 700 years. And nobody walking above it tonight is thinking about any of it. Let it carry you down gently into sleep. Sleep well, traveller. Good night.